Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, we're going to begin. All right, so my name is Alrick Campbell. Today we're going to have a very exciting session on tourism and trade. So we have 4 very distinguished panelists today, and each person will be presenting for 15 minutes. And we're going to ask that they present in sequence, and then we're going to take questions after. So the first presentation will be by Eric. He's presenting on the topic, coming by air or boat, which kind of tourist is better for the Caribbean. This will be followed by Samuel. Yes. Has the GATT-WTO promoted CARICOM trade? And finally, Susann and Wolfgang will be presenting on aligning sustainability and competitiveness in the international supply chains, a consumer-driven approach. So I'm now going to invite Eric to come and give his presentation.
I think maybe if you could, sorry. Maybe you could make it full screen. Thanks. Okay, thank you very much. So this is a joint work with Jeetendra, Khadan, and Ranita, Seecharan, essentially trying to look at the effects of cruise versus air arrival tourism. So just by way of introduction, if you look at Caribbean tourism, obviously the tourism sector is an important sector, as you know, for some islands more important than others. So as an average over all the Caribbean islands, at least in our sample, it contributes about 15% to GDP overall. 5% of that is direct, and about 13% to employment. 4% of that is about direct. So it's a relatively important sector in this regard. And the World Trade Organization of Tourism has predicted, not on account of what, I'm sure how they do it, but they say it's going to rise by another 4% in the next 10 years. Or at least that's their prediction. Now, important feature of tourism in the Caribbean in particular is that the share of cruise tourists, even though that's a global trend, but particularly in the Caribbean, has risen steadily over the period. So in 1980 it was about 55%, and now it's up to 90%. Right? So really a large part of tourism is cruise tourism for most of the islands. Now, a common complaint about cruise tourism is that it contributes much less to the local economy than non-cruise tourism, essentially air arrivals for most of the time. So there's no accommodation expenditure, obviously. Non-accommodation spending is also lower for cruise tourists versus the other ones, because they're obviously provided with a lot of service on the boat. Roughly about 50%, they've done some surveys. And purchased by cruise lines, a lot of them, the goods that they use, food products, they're purchased elsewhere, wherever they can get it cheapest or wherever they need it here. But of course, there's no really reliable quantitative evidence on that, in part because that sort of data doesn't really exist or is not collected on a comprehensive basis. One thing that this, of course, ignores is that there's also likely to be an indirect impact. And the question is, how do you measure that? And how much is the indirect impact of cruise tourism for local economy, the service sector, and these things? And the second sort of common complaint that you find in, not just in the academic literature, but overall, is that cruise tourism maybe crowds out non-cruise tourism, right? So that local service sector says we're going to focus on cruise tourism, we're not going to invest in a lot in non-tourist arrivals and these sort of things. So it's not that they're complements, but maybe they're substitutes. But again, there's no real reliable quantitative evidence in this regard. So these are essentially the 2 things that we want to look at in this paper. So the analysis depends on essentially 2 data sources. Really, one is the data that's been collected since 2000 from the Caribbean Tourism Organization, where they essentially have collected arrivals at the monthly frequency for across essentially all Caribbean islands since 2000 for both cruise and air arrivals, right? And it's the number of tourists there, so that allows us to do the analysis at the monthly frequency level here. And the second one, because we want to look at economic activity, is, well, if you look at GDP figures that are available for Caribbean, they tend to be annual. They're not available for all years, and what we really need is monthly data. But in the economics literature, what people have started using where they don't have, let's say, sufficient GDP data for whatever analysis they want to do, whether it's at the local level or at the frequency that they want, they started using nightlight intensity, right, sort of as a measure. And the basic idea that measure the brightness of individual areas at night, and you use that as some sort of measure of economic activity. And of course, there's going to be weaknesses and strengths with that. It's probably going to be very correlated with the service sector and industrial sector, not very correlated with the agricultural sector. But I guess in terms of tourism, we're not really worried so much about the agricultural sector, at least in the direct sense here. So the source there are the DMSP satellites. These essentially give you, I mean, the publicly available data. This is data that I got from the World Bank. They essentially measure satellite intensity actually at the daily level, if it's possible, if there's no cloud coverage, at the 1 kilometer level roughly, and then they normalize the intensity between 0 and 63. And we essentially have these monthly cells, and we aggregate them up at the island level here. But the question is, what do these nightlights really capture? But that's the only really high frequency measure of GDP that's available, but we have it at the monthly level. So our overall sample, given these two data sources, is over 14 years for 22 Caribbean islands. It's basically nearly balanced panel. I think there was one island, there was some tourism data that was missing here. So just to show you the graph here, so the cruise, the blue line is the cruise arrivals, and the red lines are the air arrivals. You can see obviously there's a lot of seasonal frequency, as you would expect here in this regard. They tend to move to some extent to each other and some extent not. You can see both are a little bit increasing over the period. We tried to fit a fractional polynomial to these two series, and essentially what you can see is that the air arrivals have roughly been increasing and then decreasing in the last maybe 8 or 9 years, whereas predicted cruise arrivals are roughly on an increasing trend here, right? So this is the sort of thing that you see in the aggregate figures inside here. So they capture them. This is the total over all the 22 islands that we have here. So this is the nightlight intensity. This is just a snapshot for 2013, our last data period. So you can see, essentially, it just shows individual intensities. So you can see Jamaica here, where essentially in urban areas, in those areas, it's a lot more pointed. We essentially take these cells. So Jamaica has, I think, 30,000 cells, and we just aggregate these normalized values up there at the monthly level, and that gives us hopefully some measure or proxy for GDP. Okay. So how well do these nightlights capture GDP? Because if we want them to capture the potential impact of cruise versus air arrivals on nightlights, we have to be reasonably confident. So here, just calculate out real GDP for the individual islands for which we had it at the annual level, and then we added up the annual level of these monthly nightlights over all the years here. You can essentially see there clearly is a positive correlation, but there are, of course, some outliers. I think the R squared was 0.71 or something like that. So, and this is kind of general. I think in general, I mean, in my own experience using the data, these nightlights are relatively good in capturing middle-income developing countries, but they're poor in capturing real income for highly developed or very poor developed, in part because of access to electricity. Well, they are what they are. Okay, so what we do here is we essentially run a panel var model where we essentially have our 3 endogenous variables: cruise arrivals, air arrivals, and economic activity. We unfortunately don't have much, well, really nothing else of other control variables, although we're trying to create climatic controls at this stage as well. But at the moment, the only other control variables is we put in year and month dummies for now that should capture all the seasonal and annual effects that are essentially common across all the islands here. We allow for island-specific effects that takes care of all the time-invariant unknowns. Now, the big thing is, of course, the question of causal ordering, and of course, there you can argue what it should be. What we make the assumption of is that cruise arrivals are the most exogenous, in part because these cruise arrivals, it's not just one cruise ship, as you well know, that go to one island, but it's usually a set of islands that American or British tourists will ever visit here. So we're assuming they're relatively exogenous to air arrivals, and then the last is economic activity. We tried playing around with flipping these two. It didn't really make it too much different. Yeah, these things are always assumptions yet. So you always have to worry about stationarity. These series, they were all 3 non-stationary, not surprisingly, but they were first difference stationary. So we just included first difference in these models, again with seasonal time dummies and individual island effects here. All these AIC and BIC criteria, they suggested roughly around 14 lags. One was about 16, the other one was 12, so we just kind of took the average here. It doesn't make too much difference. In terms of estimator, given that we have a large amount of T and a relatively small amount of N here, we use the least square dummy variable estimator by 0.2. And so that's essentially what we're trying to estimate. Okay, so let me just get into the results here. So this is essentially the impact of air arrivals and cruise arrivals. So we calculated out the 90% confidence bands here, and essentially what you can see is clearly there's a little bit of crowding out, at least in the initial few months here, where there's a drop in cruise arrivals as the air arrivals increases, and this kind of disappears after 5 months here, or at least becomes relatively imprecisely estimated. So it seems that there is a little bit of crowding out from air arrivals to cruise arrivals. Whatever the chances are, of course, we can't determine with the data we have here, but it tends to be relatively short-lived. Here's the impact of cruise arrivals on air arrivals, and essentially what you see here is that there's also crowding out, right? It doesn't seem, the initial drop seems a little bit smaller here, but it seems to be much more longer, at least lasting to about 12 months here, right? I mean, we tried doing it longer than these 15 months, but it kind of just becomes insignificant after a while. We start dropping data in this regard. So in comparison to the previous graph, I think what one can relatively conclude is there's kind of a little bit of substitution between these two, but the sort of crowding out effect, at least in the long term, is larger from cruise arrivals and air arrivals. And it's a little bit of what the people had in terms of the complaint. Okay, so here was the impact of both of these on economic activity, which has a larger impact. So you can both see here that there's some positive impact, right? Here for air arrivals, there's an initial jump here in about a month or two after, right? In this regard, and then it kind of seems to become much smaller and, well, at least doesn't become very precisely estimated. Whereas in comparison with cruise arrivals, there seems to be kind of an increasing impact, not always significant here, they're much more longer than here. This goes a little bit against, I guess, the conventional wisdom. So cruise arrivals seem to have a much more longer impact in terms of impact on economic activity. The problem is, of course, you know, what does this mean in terms of the actual GDP figures? And for there, you kind of would start getting into dodgy territory because you have to try to relate one unit of nightlife to GDP, and it's just not so easy in terms of monetary figures, and it doesn't really give any realistic things that we try. But we still have to look into that here. Okay, so this brings me to the conclusion, really. So I think we find there is some crowding out, or maybe you just want to call it substitution between these two. And that's after taking account of seasonal effects, so it's not a matter of that they're just part of it. If you remember from the original graph, some of the air arrivals was outside of the season of the cruise arrivals here. This seems to be particularly with regard from cruise to air arrivals, so there seems to be a much more longer term effect, well, longer term in terms of this high frequency data. There's also evidence of both air and cruise tourism adding to the local economy. In terms of the actual coefficients that we estimate, they don't seem to be that much different here. The air tourism, again, appears to be more immediate, so an immediate effect that kind of disappears, where the cruise tourism doesn't quite jump immediately, but seems to sort of increase gradually over the year and a half that comes after. I think there's a lot of weaknesses one has to think about it in terms of this paper. I mean, one is, of course, nightlights is a measure of GDP. As I said, we're not capturing agricultural activity. Even for what we're capturing, if you think about these nightlights, are just night intensity, so it's use of nightlights. It's probably residential, industrial, service sector use. How much is that really related to GDP? So are we missing out? The nightlights themselves are, of course, normalized. There's some evidence that there seems to be a lot of blooming in this regard, so it's not so clear how much we can actually put figures on this. As you saw, there's a lot of imprecision of the estimates. Yeah, there's not too much we can do about it. But I think the main criticism is these are tourism arrivals, and that doesn't say much in terms of tourism expenditure. In the few surveys that were done by this cruise arrivals organization in the US, there seems to be large differences across the islands in terms about the relative expenditure of cruise arrivals relative to air arrivals. And it just depends what sort of services are being offered. So given this, what can future research focus on? Well, one of the things that I kind of mentioned of why we chose cruise arrivals to be relatively more exogenous is that these cruise ships tend to visit several islands together. So clearly there could be spillovers in that regard that we're not taking into account, right? Spillovers from one island to another, cruise lines competing that we're not doing, because of course these are competitors in the market here. Another thing that, of course, given the stuff that I do that's more interesting to me is try to look at which type of tourism absorbs shocks more. So if we have something like a large hurricane, does cruise arrivals to that recover quickly than air arrivals? I mean, I did a study a few years ago where I looked at overall tourist arrivals, and there was an immediate impact lasting a few months, but which one is better in absorbing these shorter shocks or maybe exchange rate shocks? So that's essentially it. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Eric. So I'm now going to invite Samuel to come and give his presentation.
Okay, good morning, and thanks for coming. I don't know if Nadine took you guys to party last night. I was getting worried looking around the room. All right. Okay, so the last time I stood here 2 years ago, I was talking about gravity models, and I'm doing the same thing again this morning. To those of you who were here the last time, this is a continuation of that work. All right. So why another gravity model? Well, first of all, we must recognize over the last 3-4 decades or so that a lot of changes have happened in the world of international trade. Yes? We look to the GATT process and the subsequent formation of the WTO in 1995. And during that time also, we saw the explosion of regional trade agreements. Even here in CARICOM, we see the deepening of the CARICOM process. Yeah? So that's one reason why, for example, we want to look at gravity models and see what are the impacts of these developments. The second point has to do with the estimator, the PPML estimator, pseudo maximum likelihood. The last time I was here, I did mention that, future work would seek to include this estimator, and I will get into the reasons why, it's useful when talking about gravity. And then finally, CARICOM countries are highly open. In fact, if we look at this diagram, you'll notice that here we have Barbados, we have Belize, here is China, Guyana, Jamaica, St. Lucia, the UK, and the US. And each of these bars represent a different year. So we have 1980 first, then 1990, then 2000, 2010, 2015. Of course, on the y-axis, we have the percentage of merchandise trade, I must admit, merchandise trade as a percentage of GDP. Yes? So from this, we can see that clearly our region is very highly open. Yes? So as a bit of an overview, the question being asked here is, has the GATT-WTO promoted CARICOM merchandise trade? A few years ago, at the first WECON, I was tempted to just simply look at the WTO, just look at what was happening after the formation of the WTO. But for those of you who are here and who remember, Professor Ethia didn't mention, he said, while that is true that, 1995 is the date when the WTO was formed, we must not ignore the different trade rounds which came before that, you see? So what I do in this paper, which is similar to what Andrew Rose did in his famous 2004 paper, is to not only look simply at the WTO, but the WTO GATT. Yes? It's a panel data set, and it runs from 1980 to 2015. CARICOM trade with its major partners are included, so major partners being, say, for example, Canada, the United Kingdom, the United States, and 13 other countries. Data for the study were obtained from the IMF Directional Trade Statistics, UNCTAD, and the French database CEFI. CEFI is useful in that when you want to get information regarding the distances between capital cities and the like, you can get that information easily there. And some other, and binary variables relating to common language, common if a country was colonized by another country and so on. Those data can be had at CEFI. What I will do also is to speak a little bit about the methodology and then offer some preliminary results. In terms of selected literature, we have Egumo, Busogo, and Mendes in 2002. They did some preliminary work on trade and integration in the Caribbean, specifically looking to see what, if any, impacts were there from the formation of the WTO. Their study did not find significant improvements in trade as a result of the WTO, but in some instances they found significantly negative outcomes. And then we have the famous paper by Andrew Rose, 2004, do we really know that the WTO increases trade? And that study would have covered several countries around the world. In it, he didn't find a significant improvement in trade for countries. So for countries which were part of the WTO relative to countries which were not, country pairs which were not, there wasn't any big difference between the volumes of trade. So he concluded essentially that the WTO and the GATT, I must add, didn't significantly increase trade. Then point number 3, the Sandberg paper. My students would be familiar with this one. This paper looks at, it's a gravity model paper too, looks at trade within CARICOM and its major trade partners. This was the paper which I based my previous paper on, the one I presented 2 years ago. This is the one where we had individual ordinary least square regression. So for each year you had a particular regression. So it's pretty much cross-sectional, not panel. And then we have the seminal paper by Silva and Tenreiro in 2006. This paper spoke to the need for moving away, or rather changing the functional form from OLS type thing to pseudo-Poisson maximum likelihood estimators. And just to mention 2 reasons why. One, there is often the concern as to how we deal with zero values when we're looking at gravity models, because the model is a log linear model essentially, yes? And of course, the log of 0 is indefinite, right? You can't find the log for that. So what some papers do, where they have the 0 values, they would just add a number 1 or find some other way to deal with that 0 value. But those approaches have not been seen as robust enough. So the suggestion was made that we should use the pseudo maximum likelihood approach. Professor Woolridge would have hinted at the merits of that yesterday. So for example, we don't need to simply have zeros and ones. You can use values on a continuum. So it works in that way. And it also deals with the heteroskedasticity issue. Yes, so the errors you get, the standard errors you get from a PPML model are robust errors. And then finally, a paper by Colley, I hope I pronounced the name correct. She's Jamaican actually. Did some work in 2014 using the PPML approach, but her work did not consider the WTO and its impact on CARICOM trade, WTO/GATT. She looked at regional trade agreements with trade partners such as the DOMREP, Venezuela, and Colombia. This is what the model looks like. At point 1, so we have, we could say exports or imports. And then we have this multiplicative expression here. So Y sub IT would represent GDP per capita, by the way. We're not using just GDP, but GDP per capita, because per capita income is seen as giving a better indication of the capacity of a country to export and also the capacity of a country to import goods. So in the gravity literature, it's recommended to use per capita income. So per capita income for country I, per capita income for country J, the population of the country I, country J, distance, and then we have our binary variables, and then the error term essentially. So this expression, essentially what you would do is you would find the log of this. You log linearize that expression at 1. At this point, I think it's important to talk a little bit about the binary variables and you know, their interpretation. Milton Friedman once said that, you know, to give a good example, it's often or sometimes good to go to the extreme. So I'll give an extreme example to talk about the binary variables and how we can interpret them. So if we have a value of 0 for a particular variable, let's say common language or the WT or whatever it is, when you find the anti-log of 0, you get 1. Yes? So what that means, therefore, is that, let us say trade between two countries was 100. When you bring in that particular binary variable, you're multiplying 100 by 1, so it remains unchanged, correct? Of course, though, if you have your binary variable being some non-zero value, yes, and you find the anti-log of it, you will have some value, let's say 2 or 1.5 or what have you. So when you put it in that expression at point 1, yes, you're saying that for that particular binary variable now, trade is 1.5 times what it would ordinarily be. Yes, that's how you would interpret that. For the other variables like income, population, distance, what have you, you would read them as per the norm when you're dealing with log linear models, in the sense that if the coefficient is on distance is 1, yes, what you're saying is that a 1% change in distance, yes, would lead to a 1% change in terms of trade. Of course, it would be negative for the distance variable. All right? So that's how you would interpret these. So at point 2, fully log linearized. So if I want to run an OLS regression, least squares dummy variable, you'd use an expression similar to 2. Of course, with least squares dummy variables, we'll have to adjust the right-hand side. Yes? I don't include that here. And then the final expression would be what you would have for the PPML approach. So on the left-hand side, we're not logging the export or the trade variable. All right? And then some results. My apologies, I tried to make everything fit, and it's probably not big enough. But anyway, so I'm not going to go through all of this, but just to point out a few things. As we would expect, distance comes across as negative. So I have the OLS output, I have the LSDV output, and I have 2 PPML models. The first PPML model is one where the 0 values are excluded. Yes? The second one, the 0 values are included. But yeah, so in terms of distance across gravity models, you would expect to have some negative value here. That is, the larger the distance between two countries, the less likely they are to trade. That's the basic part of it. For me, when doing gravity models, the important thing is to look more so at your binary variables. Look at relationships. But these variables like distance and GDP and population, they're useful, so you want to be sure that whatever you're doing aligns with what the literature says. But my main concern would obviously be the binary variable. So I have language, I have a variable for CARICOM. So if the two countries that are trading with each other, if they are part of CARICOM, then it'll be given a 1. I also included the EPA, Economic Partnership Agreements, which our countries would have signed on to around 2009. What we can see is that for the EPA, it's negative across the different models. GATT-WTO is negative and significant only in the case where we have the PPML, where the zero values are added. It's not significant. My Ramsey reset test was not very, wasn't, the null hypothesis was essentially rejected here. So this is not cool. Imports results are a little more interesting in terms of Ramsey reset for my PPML models. I'll beg your indulgence just to finish this off. But we see a reversal now in terms of the GATT-WTO effect. In terms of imports, we notice that it's positive, right? While in terms of exports from the region, it was a negative. Results are consistent with CARICOM economies and changes to the edifice of international economics. Next step would be to use modified versions of the PPML estimator. And one other thing I want to mention quickly in terms of policy implications is that what we see here suggests in terms of our exports that we need to build capacity. I was going to ask a little controversial question, well, not controversial, it's history, yeah? About what happened a few years ago when Prime Minister Cameron came to Jamaica. Everyone knows what he came and said, right? He offered us to build a prison. But how many of us know about this? The Essex Valley Agricultural Development Project. So while some of us are overly concerned about Brexit and so on, and Brexit is a mess, I know, but for us here in the Caribbean, we have other things we need to concern ourselves about. And what the British High Commission is doing is seeking to build capacity in agriculture, which is one of our main areas of exports. Yeah? All right, I'll stop here before Alrick stops talking to me. Boy, 15 minutes went.
All right, so I'm now going to invite Susann and Wolfgang to give their presentation. So they're going to be interchanging throughout the presentation.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. I try to set my alarm watch in such a way that I'm not going to take too much of your time. This is the number of slides that I actually brought along, and of course now I have to squeeze this into 15 minutes. I appreciate if you help me with this, because any question that you may want to ask, I strongly encourage you to ask it right now or right in between my presentation. I strongly assume that any question raised during the presentation is not counting. Okay, what are we going to do? I would like to present to you something very simple. Just descriptive, very simple, but we believe that it's important because it deals with the ordinary man. Where do I have my control for the... Oh, okay.
You gotta give it back this time.
Okay, let's see whether we can handle that. Yeah. Does this face mean anything to you? Who has seen that face before? You have. You know who this is? Oh, right. So she's a 16-year-old girl. And she appeared at the World Economic Forum last year, and she talked to the President of China and to the Vice President of the United States and to major business and political leaders worldwide. A 16-year-old girl. It's a Friday. Today is Friday. What is Friday? Or how is Friday connected to her? Every Friday, hundreds of thousands of young kids, 16, 20 years old, skip classes at school or university and take to the streets and demonstrate for a better world, for a better environment. Actually, I'm not exactly sure what they really want, but they take to the streets, they take it very seriously. Something has to change with regard to our planet. I think we have to take that seriously because these kids are going to be the consumers of the next decade. So this is where we are coming in. Not that we saw this movement, this big global movement coming. When we started our research, We had no idea that this was happening. But somehow we feel kind of vindicated doing the kind of work that we've done because it kind of supports the idea that consumers have power over the change of economic structures. In this case, the change of economic structures with regard to sustainability in production. Here you see a typical photo of the demonstrations that happen right now. It's a Friday. And these demonstrations, although they may be a little naive in what they want, they actually represent the preferences of people who are going to be powerful consumers over the coming decades. What do we want to present to you in this, in those couple of minutes? I would like to state the problem again, have a short look at the literature, present to you a very simple model that we believe explains the relationship between sustainability, competitiveness, and the preferences of consumers. And then we would like to present to you a couple of findings about consumer preferences as they are at the moment, at this age group actually. Coincidence, we didn't know it when we did it. And we would like to make a couple of policy recommendations afterwards. The problem statement basically is, can consumer demand render sustainability in production competitive? Because that's been discussed widely. Any measure or any step towards a more sustainable production mode, we're going to lose competitiveness. That's the complaint of politicians, that's the complaint of firms. And okay, is that true? That's the question. And when we look at the literature, we can say no, not really. When we look at the empirical data, we've done a separate study about returns on investment in ESG companies, that is, say, socially responsible companies. And interestingly enough, those funds that invest in developing countries or emerging markets, in ESG companies in emerging markets have a higher performance, a better performance than regular companies, whereas this effect is slightly less strong in Europe and in the US. So it gave us some more reason to continue our research. What we did is we looked at supply chains and we said, okay, if consumers are really interested in getting sustainable products, we have to look in a globalized world, look into the supply chains, are they sustainable or not? And we try to investigate 3 different links, namely the link between the consumer and the tier 1 company, that's the company the consumer directly faces, and how can I show this? Okay. The second link would be between a tier 1 company and their supply chain members, tier X companies, and finally a link between firm reputation and firm performance, because firm reputation is basically what the consumer sees. For each of these links, we provided a literature review, which I really don't want to go into detail here. We have highlighted the, we believe, most significant literature here. Green means positive relationship for those links that I just mentioned. Red means rather casting doubt on the relationships. As you can see, the majority of those that we found to be really making a valuable contribution are seeing positive relationships between CSR, that's what in the literature, the term that's in the literature used, instead of sustainability, CSR, corporate social responsibility. A positive relationship between those links that I just mentioned, so that we believe that when we look at a model, a simple model, we can assume positive signs here between the relationship between investors, consumers, and their perception of tier 1 firms, between the strategy, the reputation, and the performance of tier 1 firms and tier 2 firms, their suppliers, so to say, and generally between CSR orientation or sustainability orientation and the reputation of firms, be they in the tier 1 or tier 2 plus range. So overall, we believe from the literature that it is possible that the customer preferences actually have a positive relationship with the CSR profile of firms in tier 1 and further down the supply chain firms. We call this this is actually exactly the wrong side. This is the demand side. Investors or consumers demand a certain CSR profile from their suppliers, and this would be the supply side. My mistake, Susann, I just mixed it up. So on the CSR is being, the profile is supplied by the firms in the supply chain. So this is something that we would like to have a closer look at. And we did this by, first of all, trying to measure the sustainability profile of the firms in the supply chain. And that's what we call Empirical Research 1 in our paper. We try to figure out, okay, how can we measure the sustainability of supply chains? And what we do is we have a trade-weighted score for sustainability of a supply chain. That is the share of a country in the supply chain measured by its weight, trade-wise weight in the supply chain, and the SSF score for sustainability. That's the score produced by the Sustainable Society Foundation, an organization based in the Netherlands that, to our understanding, has a reliable and biannual update of sustainability scores for most of the countries in the world. That's what we use, and what we then do is we look at supply chains of companies and for certain sectors and try to figure out how sustainable they are. And in what I'm presenting here is just a ranking. That is, just to give you an example, we see that, for example, the US, for food, for garments, for all products, social sustainability, in the meaning of the triple bottom line, is predominant in their supply chain, whereas economic sustainability takes the second place, ecological, environmental sustainability the last place. Now the question is this ranking of sustainability scores, is that in line with what the consumers want? And for that purpose, we set up a survey of consumers in a number of countries, and that's basically what Susann, where her competence is and where I'm utterly failed if I had to do this. So I'm asking her to present this part of our research, and we'll come back to the policy recommendations afterwards.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Wolfgang. Also for the baseline of our problem statement. So we did a second direction of research, more on the demand side. And what we looked for was for the countries of the residents, so because we want to know something about culture as well. We asked about the reputation of countries and companies, whether people think that the reputation of the country of origin is more important than the reputation of the product and company. And we also tried to divide between different industries or businesses. So we set up a questionnaire, and we tried to operationalize culture by the nations. So we know there are some critics we could discuss here, but we won't discuss, just to show what we did. And we used, as Wolfgang already said, 21 indicators of the Sustainable Society Index, and we asked people to judge how important these aspects are if they think about sustainability, and how important they are if they think about buying food or garments. So we had 1,310 participants in our survey. Male were a little bit less presented than females. The average age was about 30 with a standard deviation of 10. So we have quite a wide range, but mostly we asked students here. So we have to keep this in mind, but it is more or less also part of the future generation. So we have more or less an equal sample size of Europe and Asia, a little bit about 500 participants. We are less successful in Latin America, so help is highly appreciated here. So we have a little bit less than 200 participants of Latin America. So in the graph you can see the main countries where we have lots of participants, but you can see we have in the end participants from 46 countries. So our first question was whether people think that the reputation of the country of origin is more important, or the reputation of the producing company. So what we did is, what you can see is, we have different aggregation levels here. It is all participants. Here we have the participants from Europe, Asia, and Latin. And here we have selected some countries, and we try to choose the main target countries for CARICOM states. So this is where you would export your products to. So therefore we chose China, India, and Mexico, and the US here. So what you can see is that the people said that they would rank the reputation of the producing company higher than the reputation of the country of origin. This is true for all these aggregate levels, but you can also see that there are differences in the distance between this importance. So in Germany you see a high distance here, but you see in China the distance is quite low. So next question was about the same thing what Wolfgang did with the supply chains. We asked about the importance of the three columns, or the three dimensions of sustainability: social, ecological, and economic. And you see that in all, on all aggregate levels and in all countries, social sustainability is ranked higher than ecological sustainability and higher than economic sustainability. We see the same pattern here, but we also have countries where this ranking order is in a different way. So, and also you see, even if the patterns are more or less the same, you see again differences in the distances between these importances. So now we got the step that we thought, okay, we will match these patterns together with the patterns of the supply chains, or about the sustainability implementation. So when we try to do it for the CARICOM countries, we found out that there are very few imported products which you really produce further on, so you more or less export yourselves raw material and products, but you don't have really supply chains. So what should we do? We decided to take the SSI values, so the Social Sustainability Society Index values, which say something about how strong is the implementation of sustainability in these countries. So you see here the values for Cuba, Dominican Republic, Haiti, and Jamaica. And this is the supply side. So what you offer your customers, and here we have the demand side. This is what the participants of our questionnaire want to see. So what you see here is that we find, of course, the patterns we already know on the right-hand side, but we see that Cuba and Jamaica have more or less the same patterns as the demand side. Okay, in Jamaica we have big differences. They are not that big on the consumer side. And but these structures meet the consumer needs for the moment best. So, but on the right-hand side you see the perception of sustainability, or the importance of sustainability in general. Therefore we got a step further on and asked, what's the matter if the consumers buy food? This is the upper side graphic, and if they buy garment, it's the lower side graphic. And here you can see that the demand side is more balanced if they buy garments. And here you can see that Dominican Republic is a little bit more matching here from the supply side. So we also tried to do some correlations between cultural values and sustainability, because we thought sometimes you don't have the opportunity to ask your customers beforehand. So here we could have data which could predict some sustainability orientation in the countries. The green ones are the positive correlations, so the masculinity index of Hofstede and the indulgence index of Hofstede are positively correlated, and the long-term orientation is negatively correlated with sustainability importance. Here I took together the numbers of China, India, and the United States again. So green are the positive correlations, that means high bars mean high sustainability implementation or demand. The red bar means if it's low, then the sustainability demand is high. So we could predict that the United States have high sustainability demand here. This could be another way to find out what your customers want. But to use this already is a little bit too early, because in the literature we find different and sometimes also contradicting results, so we have to do something more here. This is just to summarize what we found out with the empirical research in the second direction for consumers. I think I don't have to repeat it, but we want to give you some policy options, some suggestions. But this is not my field of competence, therefore I give back to Wolfgang. He is the economist here and can do it much more sophisticated than I could.
Thank you. Okay, so what can we do? We have developed tools that allow consumers to analyze the supply chain of products they might want to buy. We developed a tool that allows the companies to identify the preferences of the consumers in the market they target. So this is, and both tools are very simple. They can be used by the ordinary buyer, by the ordinary company without big problems, because the data are available. Either they have been compiled by us or they are public available. That's no big deal. So what can politics do in order to support that move towards a more sustainable production? Because there is one problem. We have the supply side, where the demand side. What we do not have is then sufficient transparency, sufficient, say, information to the public that allows people to easily take care of these possibilities of changing their consumption pattern. When I look at the picture of this of Greta Thunberg that I showed you in the beginning, I remember when she was asked at this economic conference in Davos in Switzerland, well, what should we do? What should we change in order to become more sustainable in our global production goals? She said, everything. We should change everything. And of course, everybody laughed and said, well, this is naive. And actually, I'm a grandfather. It drives tears into my eyes when I see how sweet and naive these kids are. And they say, oh, yes, we have to change everything. Well, as professionals, we know it's not possible. As professionals, we have to focus on those things that are most relevant for a change. And we use this policy impact model that I have taken it from my consultancy in development politics and used it here to identify a couple of rather, say, of measures that might have a significant impact on move towards more sustainable production goals. And the first thing is that we should, in the area of processes, we should establish global criteria for sustainable production, because that's actually not there. We don't have it. And in particular, when we come to products, what we definitely need is a change, a reform of the harmonized system that categorizes products at the tariff line level for companies. At the moment, no company, no consumer has an opportunity to actually identify, is this product a sustainably produced product or is it not? It's not there. We don't have it. And of course, it would be necessary. We do have it at the 10-digit HS level. That is, some national variants of the harmonized system do allow for an identification of sustainably produced products, but that doesn't help if we import it from abroad. It's only used internally. So I think that's one of the major changes that have to happen in order to allow consumers wisely choose their products they want to consume. Then, of course, in the area of education, this refers to mostly to companies, to countries where our consumers are located. The knowledge about environmental side effects of production is relatively low. The recycling process is very little known. It's amazing what I've looked into German recycling processes, and what I discovered in the past couple of months, I was shocked. I did not know. So there's an important role for education in the major importing countries, and that might lead to something like name and shame. Those processes, those products that actually violate what we believe is a reasonable, sustainable production mode should be named, and the consumer should have a choice to say, no, that's not what I want. In the area of publicity, that is well, public awareness creation. We should name and nominate, that is, provide bonus to those institutions, to those companies that actually produce sustainably valuable products or use processes that are sustainable, valued in the social, ecological, or in the economic sense. And of course, suggestion for further research. Certainly we need to look a little more into the behavioral side of consumers and investors, that is more cultural differentiation is in place. We should look at different measures of competitiveness. There is a lot of contradiction when we measure competitiveness of companies and countries that are more or less sustainable. We got not really convincing results. There needs to be done a lot more. As I said, the sustainability scores are most important. We need to combine them with the harmonized system, otherwise we will never be able to properly identify products that have been produced in a sustainable way. Well, these would be our major tasks in the future for this, in this area of research. Thank you for your attention.
All right, so thanks very much to both of you for such an enlightening presentation. We're now going to invite a few questions from the audience. I'm sure you're burning, you have some burning questions here. Okay, who has any question?
Thanks. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I actually have questions for each speaker, but to allow everybody else to ask questions, I'll just ask one right now. I think I'll begin with the last presentation, Dr. Susann and Dr. Wolfgang. I like the recommendations generally. I'm a bit concerned about whether or not you're capturing demand or if you're capturing preferences. Because sure, people may want sustainably produced goods or want whatever they consume to come from a sustainable supply chain, but when they have to pay the cost, because sometimes to produce sustainably, you may have to pay a premium, and then when you come to vote with your wallet, you know, you may want it, but when you're faced with a budget constraint, you may not be able to buy it. And so I'm concerned about whether you capture preferences or if you capture demand.
Thanks for this question. This is also more or less a question we have already discussed. So in our questionnaire, we asked for preferences. So, but we have already thought about to do some experiments to really find out the willingness to pay for implementing the preferences. So this is more or less what you said. We can just say preferences are really demand in the business sense. So at the moment we are more or less on the head side, but we want to do some experiments here. They are already in queue.
Let me add something. I would like to congratulate you on this question because it shows that you have a deep economic understanding. You see demand as something well defined, and of course when we use the term demand side, it's not that we actually show demand for products here. We call it the demand side of our model. Okay, but thank you very much for clarifying that. I didn't say that in the presentation.
All right, do we have any more questions?
Thank you for a very insightful presentation. So I think my point is a bit related to what my neighbor said. When I was listening to the presentation, I was wondering, I could think of sustainable product as relatively sophisticated goods. So I was wondering if you saw any pattern of correlation with the level of development, because I would expect, and I think it's also related to the price, how much people are willing to pay and what value they attach to a sustainable environment. So, do you notice any correlation with the level of development? So the second question is, how do we move to that equilibrium where firms gravitate towards more sustainable production? And in that regard, I was wondering, how do you police that? I mean, you probably have free rider along the way, because, I mean, any firm, there is no barrier for a firm to pretend that they're producing sustainably eventually reputation, they will get caught by reputation. They will have a reputational risk. But the transition might be challenging in the sense that firms may claim all kinds of things until they get caught by consumers. So what regulatory structure could be thought of to solve that transition challenge? And on the first presentation, I was wondering what is really specific to CARICOM in the GATT-WTO changes, and one maybe possibility is not so much to look at the bilateral trade within CARICOM, but how trade within CARICOM has compared to trade with non-CARICOM. So kind of how benchmark that against what's happening with the rest, and then you can maybe claim that within CARICOM has relatively improved compared to what's happening outside of CARICOM. Because trade patterns will have shifted significantly over time, and I was wondering to which extent the model captured that trend. Sorry for taking so much time.
Okay, regarding your first question, whether there is any clear pattern of, say, preferences for sustainability depending on development stage, is that, did I interpret that correctly? There are differences, but they don't appear to be aligned with the stage of development, rather with regions, global regions. So we do identify, Susann would be able to explain that much better, but we do have a difference in preferences, say, in the Asian area as compared to the European countries. That's identifiable, but we could not really align that with stage of development. Interestingly, what we found is that Germany is relatively close to, in terms of preference structure, relatively close to some of the Asian countries, say China and I think maybe Vietnam, I'm not quite sure. So you see that obviously in this case at least, it illustrates that development stage doesn't, at least we haven't had an explicit look at it, but what we saw was not significant. Your second question. When we look at the, that's what I mentioned in the presentation as well. When we look at the performance of companies, we see a relatively strong performance in the Asian emerging markets with regard to sustainability in the wider sense, ESG indicators. And that shows that obviously there is, say, competitiveness in the sense of probably cost savings when they focus on sustainable production. You mentioned the free rider program. Of course, that's correct, but here we look at countries. And of course, inside the countries, you might say there is one company that really violates the say, sustainability conditions, whereas another company does not. There are, at the moment, attempts at measuring the sustainability at a company level. There are some institutions that try to do this, and that's something that we have mentioned on our policy suggestion sheet as well, but I didn't mention it here verbally, expressively, because these are self-assessment modes. That is, there are organizations that send out, say, a questionnaire to the company concerned. Mostly they do this for the tier 1 companies in order to make sure that they have an overview of what their tier 2+ companies do with respect to sustainability. So they get some kind of information on sustainability scores, but as far as I know, it's mostly self-reporting, and of course this is open to cheating. I don't exactly know how they make sure that they minimize cheating. It's something we want to look into. That's what we have listed on our to-do list as well. But it's maybe you have more information about company behavior in the with respect to sustainability scores. But what I would like to mention as well, because you said, can we afford to buy sustainable products? Well, yes. What we observed in Germany, at least, is that there are a number of products that, after having been introduced as, say, ecologically friendly, the price of these products really went down because a mass market developed and they benefited from mass production. So this is something that you should keep in mind. Obviously, the bigger the market for these products is, the more they benefit from economies of scale and can compete with regular products. It's an interesting development, but I haven't looked into the cost structure of environmentally friendly production so far.
All right. So I'm going to attempt to answer the question. If I don't do so, you can always just ask again. So the data starts in 1980. Why? Prior to that, there's an insufficient, database for Caribbean countries. So we started in 1980. The results are mixed. I know I didn't get a chance to really spend much time talking about them. The results are mixed. The results I focus on are the results coming from the PPML model, because we're seeing that as the superior model compared to the other two. In terms of Caribbean exports, what we see is that the outcome is significant and negative. So when we find a anti-log of that value, that I think, what's the value? It's minus 0.2285. That corresponds to a reduction in trade of 20%. Yes? When we go to the import side of things now, we see a different story. We see where GATT-WTO membership actually leads to an increase in trade. In fact, for the PPML model where we exclude the zero values, we see a 20% increase in trade. For the PPML model where we include the zero values, we see a 50% increase in trade. All right? So, again, I'm not sure if I've answered what you asked. So, but I leave that there, and you can always go again.
Yeah. No, just quickly, I was also wondering. So, if you were to compare those numbers with non-CARICOM trade, so I'm trying to see how relatively CARICOM has, the dynamics within CARICOM to the dynamics outside. So if you were to compare a non-CARICOM world, how would those numbers that you quoted be? What would they be? That's kind of what I had in mind.
When you say non-CARICOM world, all right, let me. The thing is, I'm not sure I could answer the question in the context of what I did. So for me, I have a CARICOM variable. What that means is that if the two trade partners are CARICOM countries, they get a value of 1. If we have two countries, one is a CARICOM country, one is a European country, yes, signatory to the EPA, then under the EPA variable, that gets a 1.
Okay, so
you see? Yeah, yes, they're not. So, okay, so here's the thing. So there are CARICOM countries, and then there are 16 non-CARICOM countries. Those 16 countries are the major trade partners for CARICOM. Yes? So in doing the gravity model now, you'll have to say, okay, we have a binary variable for CARICOM, and we want to see, well, okay, if being a member of CARICOM, how does that impact on trade? And across the gravity model literature, it's established that if countries, the two countries are part of a regional trade agreement, you would expect to see some greater volume in trade. And that value is significant. It's actually 1.4. If I find the anti-log of that, it would be like about 16 times or something like that. Don't quote me on that number. Anyway, yeah. All right.
Okay. All right. Does anyone have any question for Eric? I have a question for Samuel, but we'll get back to them. Yes, go ahead.
Okay. If I can steal the opportunity to just shoot out the two questions I had. One was for Dr. Strobl. I know that you identified the weaknesses in using light intensity for getting a measure of GDP on the scale that you wanted, the level, the frequency that you wanted, and you also pointed out a weakness in terms of I believe it was tourism and linking GDP from tourism with tourism arrivals. I'm wondering if trying to do some form of regression or estimation of the impact of tourism arrivals on GDP derived from tourism, if that could be helpful in helping you overcome that particular challenge. And for Dr. Braithwaite, trade isn't my area of expertise, but I'm wondering, is the WTO supposed to promote trade, or is it supposed to regulate and govern and make sure the rules of trade are followed? In my head, I'm thinking the latter. I don't think the WTO is supposed to promote CARICOM trade. So those are my comments and my question. Yeah.
Yeah, that would be nice to do, but we'd need monthly GDP data for that. That's the real problem. So our analysis is high frequency. The only thing we can do is maybe use annual GDP, relate that to nightlights, and then translate 1 unit of nightlight to 1 unit of GDP and infer something. But yeah.
Which I imagine would be particularly difficult given at least what I understand about electricity consumption in the region. I wouldn't be very trustful of results obtained from linking, a unit of light with GDP per se. But I understand the challenge, and I don't have an answer to how to overcome the challenge.
For some countries it's better, for some it's worse. I know,
yes.
I've tried with Haiti, and it's just very poor because electricity access is poor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, can I just follow up with that? Can you just give me the reason again for why you use nightlights as a proxy for economic activity?
Because ideally we would like to have monthly GDP for all of the 22 islands, and that data simply doesn't exist. And we wanted to look at how each of these types of tourism affects economic activity or GDP or local wealth or whatever you want.
But for you to use nightlight, you have to be assuming that there's some production going on at night, right? I think I don't get the underlying reason. I understand what you're trying to do, but I'm thinking the link between nightlight.
It's one of those things. There's lots of economists who use it now. I think the basic assumption is that electricity consumption is related to GDP, right? In reality, at face value, what it simply is, it's just intensity of night lights, right? So probably richer residential areas are better lit, industrial sectors are probably better lit in those things, right? So it's kind of facing the lack of data, people have used nightlight intensity with all its weaknesses as a proxy for it. And they've shown it where they had GDP data that it can be a reasonable proxy, given its limitations.
I'm just thinking that factories have to be open at nights I still don't get it. What is it?
Kind of an average. But sorry,
I don't get it.
Isn't it possible to actually get data on electricity production? Because your nightlight is proxy electricity production, but getting actual electricity production shouldn't be the hardest job in the world, is it?
To do what exactly? I mean, even that you won't get at the monthly level, right? I mean, clearly nightlight intensity is related to electricity.
Yeah, but electric companies, I mean, usually there's like one per country, and they should have data on how much they produce.
Consumption, probably.
They do have that data, but there are two issues. One is getting access to it, and two, for a country like Jamaica with our electricity peaking in the evening, theoretically, the underlying reason for using light intensity is that implicitly you assume you're burning electricity for productive purposes.
No. That electricity use is somehow related. He's not saying how it is related, but a country that is engaged in more production and have higher GDP will have use of more lights. It's not that necessarily that every time a light is burning that there's some production going on. Yeah. It's a crude proxy. I'm suggesting a less crude proxy. Because the thing with electricity is that you're right, the electricity could be used for services. So electricity is probably a best proxy when you're dealing with manufacturing and running machines. But agricultural production may not use a lot of electricity. Lawyers' offices, the amount of electricity they use per unit of output would be very different from running a machine.
I mean, I think and not a problem with that, but I think at the very minimum, most people using nightlights would agree that it captures electricity consumption, right? So then the question is, why go through all the effort of trying to get another measure of electricity consumption? What we're really concerned about is, I mean, in general, people use nightlights, that's all it captures. It has nothing to do with industrial activity or other types of wealth indicators, right? I mean, people kind of put that all into a black box. So I think the concern of whether it's capturing electricity use is probably less so. I mean, only in terms of, okay, if all factories turn off all lights at night, but most of these factories tend to be, at least for security reasons, lit. Whether that's a true capture of electricity is a different story.
I think Wolfgang wants to...
Yeah. Just to answer. All right, yes, so, yes, the WTO, if you look at this process all started after the Second World War, and there was failure to have an international organization. And so eventually we had several rounds of trade agreements until the WTO was formed in '95. So yes, the idea of the WTO is to have a world where there's freer and fairer trade. Yes? But that being said, there's still a question or it's still a concern, especially for developing countries, as to whether or not you know, this move has increased our trade, especially when you look at what's happening in, or what happened in Europe with the removal of, you know, all these, the agreements we had with European countries and moving toward a more reciprocal trade policy, yeah? So, yeah, it can be, it's worthwhile looking at it or asking the question. And by the way, just to repeat again, what I did was not just to look at intra-CARICOM trade, you know. It's trade between Guyana and Jamaica, Guyana and Trinidad, Guyana and the US, Guyana and the UK, and the like. All right?
Yeah, I think let me just come back to your question about light as an indicator of economic activity. I think in the past it's been shown to be a relatively robust indicator. And the problem that you have when you look at electricity consumption data or production data is that losses, the efficiency of the network cannot be identified. You don't know what the data of the companies, if they make them available, what they actually show. And the second thing is that you don't see, or the progress in, say, light production, that is efficiency of light production, is also not shown. Say, energy saving measures. Take an LED bulb compared to a regular bulb, and it's a fraction of the use. What does that mean? I mean, potentially you have lower electricity production numbers and higher economic activity. So as far as I know, skylight is actually one of those indicators that best reflects economic activity. I would prefer it to data of electricity companies. I don't know the situation in Jamaica, but when I look at other countries where the network is horrible, where there are lots of leakages, the data of the company are not really reliable.
We can take one more question from the audience.
Sam, so I don't remember what was the coefficient on the WTO. Was it positive or negative? Significant? What was it?
Yeah, so...
I'm just following up with what you said and then what...
All right, so for the OLS, the pool regression, it was all negative. But remember, the focus here is to use the better estimator, which would be the PPML. So on the PPML, we have some conflicting results. For the export side of things, that is CARICOM exports, quote unquote, what we have is it's negative and significant. But on the import side, we see where it's positive and significant.
Okay. All right. I just going to ask the final question to Sam. Right. So I noticed that your coefficients were highly significant, and the standard error is very low. I'm a bit skeptical of results like that. Can you give us an indication as to why that is the case?
Well, the simple answer to that is this. With the PPML approach, the errors are robust. Yes? So they're under a higher level of rigor. Put it that way. I think that's the simplest answer I can give.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, thanks very much.
And four, yeah, I know I always do this, I'm sorry. So Eric, if the light intensity is a crude proxy for economic activity, then it means that it's measured with arrow. And so I'm just thinking that, so your results are likely to be biased downwards. And so which means that maybe when you're seeing insignificance, then that is actually, that could be significance. You see what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the standard error says, particularly with those results with regard to night lights, I'd be skeptical of a little bit. I agree with that. I mean, the real worry is whether night lights is a good capture of, let's say, the indirect spillovers, or at least it's a different, let's say the indirect spillovers from cruise tourism are very different from air arrivals tourism than those standard errors, or the downward bias could be different between the two, right? So that's the real worry, and that we have no clue about, right? Otherwise, they're just both imprecisely measured, but if for one reason where we kind of find more or less the effect disappears for air arrivals, that has to do with the fact that just these spillovers, maybe it has more spillovers to the local agricultural economy because hotels buy more of their foods locally rather than cruise. I mean, we don't really know what's driving it. That's the real problem. So I think your point is.
All right, one final comment from Sam.
Yeah, just this your question again. For gravity models, it's not uncommon to see high significant values, Okay. Yeah, it's,
All right, we'll discuss it after.
Yeah, man. Mm-hmm.
All right, thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen. You have been very good today. We can now go to our regular coffee break. All right, thanks very much. All right, let's.
Session of this conference. Our first speaker is Ethel Williams.
Yes, good morning, everyone. I'm Ethel Williams, and I'm from the University of the West Indies. Yes, and my presentation today is on the impact of education on intentional homicides. Now, before I get into the presentation, I'd like to let you all know that this research is still in the preliminary stages, right? So it hasn't fully completed. But also, I'd like to give a background as to how I generated this project. I remember this project is the research component of econometric theory 2. And I remember putting out my all in this research and handed it in my first draft. And on the last page, my lecturer wrote, "Ethel Williams, you are not taking this course seriously." Now that was an estimation of my all. Now realizing that my estimation then was biased. So now knowing that I'm not good at making unbiased estimations, I then applied consistency to the work. And then I realized I started tending to my true potential. So, and this was the end result. So this paper empirically investigates the impact of education and intentional homicides for 2013, using the education index as the proxy to measure educational attainment. The ordinary least squares estimation method, which utilized cross-country data for 115 countries, was applied. Oh, okay. I'm okay. It's just working. Now, my presentation outline is, of course, the motivation, objectives, methodology, results, conclusion, and then my personal recommendations. Remember, it's my recommendation, so please understand. Motivation. Now, in assessing the impact of education on intentional homicides, different proxies for measuring education level produces different results. For example, we have when Fajin Zilber, 1998, utilized the secondary enrollment rate as a proxy to measure education. There was a positive, significant impact on intentional homicides, while when they utilized the mean year of schooling in the adult population, there was it has had a significant crime reducing impact. Now, there is also a need for a more aggregate measure of the level of education to ascertain its influence on criminal behavior. Now, why is the education index deemed to be an aggregate measure? Now, the United Nations publishes the Human Development Index yearly, and in it has the education index. The education index takes the average of two sub-indices, the mean year of schooling index and the expected year of schooling index. Now, the education index ranges from 0 to 1, 1 being the highest theoretical value possible, which indicates perfect educational attainment. Now, when the two indices are calculated, the calculations are then aggregated and to give a population-weighted measure. Now, the objectives. We will seek to answer the following questions. Does an improvement in a country's level of educational attainment reduces the level of intentional homicides for that particular nation? If yes, by how much? Does being an organization or an OECD member state has any effect unintentional homicide if educational attainment level increases. There's an increase in the level of educational attainment in Latin American and Caribbean countries, resulting in a reduction in intentional homicide rates in comparison to European and Central American nations. And finally, do developing countries stand to benefit more from an increase in the level of educational attainment in comparison to the more developed nations? My baseline econometric model and methodology, we have the log of intentional homicides, delta naught or intercept, the log of education, we have the Gini coefficient, Gini index, the log of GDP, unemployment squared, the log of poverty and urbanization. Now, intentional homicide has measured the number of homicides per 100,000 population. Now, why is the log taken? Two reasons. Firstly, in the literatures of this nature, it is normal for you to take the log as in a regression, in a research by Hart 2015, they had log-dependent intentional homicides. And in my case now, there were outlier problems, and taking the log made those outliers insignificant to the model, those observations. The same goes for education, the log of education. Now you'd ask, the index is from 0 to 1, why take the log? How do you log 0? Then personally, I can say that I went through the data and we had no 0 values, so the log was taken. The Gini index measures income distribution. The log of GDP, majority of the literature you will find GDP per capita log, so it was taken in this instance. Now, unemployment squared, which measures the percentage of the total labor force that is unemployed. It is squared because of two reasons. Well, one reason. Cohen, 1985, proved that education, its impact on intentional homicide had positive and negative. They had not positive and negative impact. When on a level effect, it was positively related, and on an aggregate effect, it was negative. So the square was taken to see how best it fits this model. Now, log of poverty, as shown in other literatures, so it was logged here, and urbanization, which shows urbanization, the growth in the urban population as a percentage of the total population. Our preliminary test results, we have, you can see the correlation with the independent variables on intentional homicides. Only one of those variables were insignificant in correlation to the log intentional homicides, and that was the log of GDP per capita. Yes. Now, the results. You can see the log variable education had a beta coefficient of 0.752. 1 star indicated that it is a 10% level of significance. So we'd see that a 1% increase in the education index score reduces intentional homicides by 0.752%. Very marginal, but still significant. Countries, the OECD nation had a beta coefficient 0.986, significant at all levels. So countries who are members of OECD will, on average, experience 0.986 slight reduction in intentional homicide per 100,000 population in comparison to non-OECD nations. Countries from the Caribbean and Latin American region would, on average, face 1.30 higher intentional homicide rate per 100,000 population in comparison to countries from Europe and Asia, significant at all levels. An increase in the level of education we found in developing economies would have no advantageous effect on intentional homicides in comparison to high-income countries. Now, one of my main findings. As you can see in my main model, the main model, I did not have corruption. But something that I found out is that when I added corruption to the main model, two things happened. Now, education, it rendered the education, the log of education insignificant. And not only that, but the sign changed from a negative to a positive. Now, one would think that, of course, this might be correlation issues. But when you look at the standard errors, we know that it normally inflates. You have a 0.471. And if you go back to slide 7, you look at the standard error for the log of education, it's 0.443. So one could say that it is not correlation problems. So, collinearity, sorry, problems. So I tend to explain, how could I explain this phenomenon that in the presence of corruption, we had a positive education is positively related to intentional homicides, and also I need to explain its insignificance. Now I needed to find a country in which there is high corruption, a marginally fair enough educational attainment level, and high intentional homicides. So now going through the data, I stumbled upon Jamaica. So I said, now, how can I analyze this? So I tried to use some, one could argue, micro variables to analyze. So I looked at Jamaica, and I should have printed the summary statistics. The education index for Jamaica is 0.67, which is above average of 0.5, as indicated on the summary statistic table. So it is fairly high. But the intentional homicide rate is 54.12, which is way above average. The average from the summary statistics is 8.17 per 100,000 population. Now there you see high corruption, high education and high intentional homicide. Then I thought about, at that time, the high crime rates in the parish, a parish in Jamaica called St. James. It is rampant for corruption, particularly lottery scamming. So now I found that there is high education, in the presence of corruption, high intentional homicides. But that was insignificant in explaining the difference, the fluctuations in intentional homicides. So that level of education over there in St. James could be of the minority group. So it is insignificant in explaining the changes in intentional homicides. One could argue that those educated persons participating in lottery scamming might be university graduates who focus on getting good grades rather than learning, and they couldn't find a job, so they participated in lottery scamming. So they are the minority group, while the majority are those who focus on learning. So they got a job, and then they are actually the majority, which could explain the change, but the level in St. James is insignificant. So that is how I came about to explain this phenomenon. So, and in the presence of corruption, education and also urbanization had no effect on intentional homicide. So with urbanization, in the presence of corruption, one could argue that people are making money from black market activities, right? So migrating from rural to urban wouldn't make any difference, so they would be reluctant to committing crime. So that is how I explain that. Omitted variable bias tests, omitted variable tests, insignificant, greater than 0.05. Or VIF, mean VIF 1.17, no strong correlation. Then we have our conclusion. Now, an increase in education level will reduce a country's intentional homicides per 100,000, as pointed out by Usher 1997 and Fajinzilbar et al. 2000. Countries are found to generally have lower intentional homicide if they are OECD members of state, but experience higher intentional homicides if they are a part of the Caribbean or Latin American region. In the presence of corruption, fluctuations in the level of educational attainment was insignificant in explaining the vast difference in intentional homicides across space. The policy implication of such result implies that should policymakers implement crime reduction policies by targeting the level of education, such policy will be deemed futile if the nation is too corrupt. My recommendations now, in the case of crime reduction, the government should focus less on economic growth policies, as it is proven to be insignificantly impact intentional homicide. GDP right throughout the model was per capita was insignificant, did not affect the homicide rate. So I'd recommend policies of economic development, developmental policies that involves more government intervention in inner cities, development projects. Inner city sports program is an effective way of fostering friendly community integration, and which is a method of occupying the time of unemployed inner city youths. More sustainable approach to anti-corruption campaigns by the nation's citizens through activist groups. And finally, I would also promote a Hope for Children development program, which is a program where children between the ages 9 to 15 years would participate in a summer camp in which counseling, education, and extracurricular activities are performed. This bridges the gap between the inner city communities and also foster more amicable inter-garrison community linkage, which would help in crime reduction, as Faginsin-Burr, 1998, pointed out that efforts to educate the young may not produce crime reduction immediately, but eventually leads to reduction of crime, especially of violent ones. That concludes my presentation. Thank you.
All right, morning, everybody. Today I'm going to look at Black engineering student success. This is mainly in or applicable to a US environment. I'm working with colleagues from Purdue University in the College of Engineering. And so please keep that in mind as we go through. So diversity has been a term that has been thrown around a lot recently. And it's very important because diversity of thought is very important as we go through problem solving. And especially for engineers, for example, when they started using the crash test dummy, females were still 47% more likely to be injured because of the fact that the test dummy was being made by males and the different characteristics of females weren't being considered. So it's very important at all times that you have some diversity of thought. We all bring different experiences to whatever situations. Underrepresented minorities, though, in educational settings will face different challenges than their majority counterparts in majority institutions. And therefore, their retention is going to be important. So I'm going to give you some motivation and speak about my methodology, the split population survival analysis. Look at the data and results, and please also note that it's all very preliminary. And of course, I will go into what we intend to do given what we have now seen. So this is pretty much what the demographic looked like at an R1 institution, fall 2016, their intake. As you can see here, so all of this is what would have been considered the majority group, or Hispanic and Latinos are 85 out of the 2,000 plus entrants, or Black African Americans are represented as 38, American Indians, 1, and if you were registered as 2 or more URMs, underrepresented minorities, then there are about 26 of you. What is important to note though, in this group, I'm going to focus on Black students specifically. It does not include international students, because in this registration system, we are logged as international and not necessarily Black, and so we're not covered there. So we are dealing with American Black students. So here are some of the challenges that are faced. Academic isolation, social isolation, negative stereotypes, financial insecurity. In the face of these, what some of these minority groups have done is that they've created societies or mechanisms to assist students in staying in the program and actually completing the degree. So as it relates to Black engineers, there's a group called NSBE, National Society of Black Engineers, and their aim is to increase the number of culturally responsible Black engineers who excel academically, succeed professionally, and positively impact the community. It is US-based, even though they have 30,000 plus members globally. And they have 3 different levels. There's the collegiate level, undergraduate and graduate students. There's a pre-college level, and then also there's, as I mentioned, the professional level. NSBE has already been identified as a key contributing factor to the success of Black engineering students. But what is happening is that there is not a lot of empirical quantitative data to support this. So that's what we're going to look at now. Again, I have a 6-year graduation rate. And we can see from here, our black line here is our non-underrepresented minority students, or what we could call the majority students. Or non-NSBE members, that's their graduation rates. And we can see that the Black NSBE members, with the exception of what happened in 2007, you can see that it's above the Black non-NSBE members. So what we want to do is investigate now what is happening here. So we are going to examine the variables associated with retention. We're going to use traditional variables such as demographics, etc. But we're also now going to include the cultural variables, including this NSBE participation type variable. And we are going to look at the temporal patterns exhibited. So here are my variables of interest. I have them in 5 categories. Here are the first 3 categories, are demographics, age, and gender. Or cultural student organization participation, that's our NSBE variable. So have you ever been a member of NSBE, participated in NSBE in the first semester? Or the number of years participated in NSBE. And there is also a program called the Minority Engineering Program, which is for all minorities. So we also want to capture some of that. There is a bridge program that students participate in prior to the summer prior to entering their undergraduate program. There is a first-year seminar Engineering 180. There's also a tutorial center which they can use. And just to be clear, the green ticks means that we currently have the data. The red X's mean we're working on getting the data. So there are pre-enrollment markers also, or SAT scores, high school GPA, and then there's a time-varying semester information GPA by semester. So we also have now information on when students departed from the program, if they departed from the program. So we looked at the first 7 semesters, so that takes us to semester 1 of students' 3rd year at this institution. And so we can have number of semesters they completed, whether they exited the program, yes or no. And we also have access to why they exited the program. Here, exited is meaning that you have left without getting an engineering degree. So I'm not interested in those who have necessarily graduated. That's not considering well, I'm going to still use them in my analysis, but that's not considered as an exit. An exit means either you changed your major, meaning outside of engineering, not within the engineering college, you dropped, or you withdrew. Voluntary withdrawal is usually more for financial reasons, while dropping is usually more for academic reasons. So there's a difference between those two. So this takes us to survival analysis. Now that I have these two things. I have number of semesters completed, so I have length of, let's call it life, and I have whether you quote unquote died or not. And this is where survival analysis comes in. It was originally used in clinical trials and the pharma industry. And essentially we're looking at time to event of data. What's the probability of you living past a specific time given that you lived up to that time? That's really what we're interested in. A key component of this data is what we call censoring. So censoring means that after a certain point, in our case, after semester 7, we are not sure what happened to you. Did you leave the program, or did you graduate, or are you still in the program? So just so that you have an idea, anything up between T0, which is the beginning of the study, and T star, the end of the study, we say those are non-censored data. I could have an individual, for example, B, who died after my time, but I wouldn't have known that, so we consider that right censored. And I could have had an individual D who continues to live. I know it sounds morbid, death and life and whatever, but just work with the terminology, because that's what we're interested in, death and life at this point. The issue here, though, is, sorry, before I go to that. I like the issue because it takes me into something else. But there are 3 functions that we're first interested in. There's the density function, the survival function, and the hazard function. All these 3 are related, and once I know one, I can get the other 2. The hazard function, though, is what we're going to focus on here. It's a proportion of those who are still in the program up to time t that should be expected to leave the program between time t and the next time period. It's a conditional probability, so it differs from the density function itself. One key assumption of survival analysis, though, is that everybody must die. So if you think about it from a medical perspective, yes, at some point we are all going to go. But in the case of what I'm looking at, that is not true. Because if everybody died, it means that there was nobody leaving with a degree, no black student leaving with a degree in engineering, and that is not true. And so that takes us to our split population analysis. It's going to account for observations that actually are considered to be quote-unquote cured, i.e. you complete the program. It has 2 components. There's a risk component, so i.e. the likelihood of you leaving the program, and we will estimate this probability pi I using a logistic function. And it also has a duration component, so given that you are going to die, how long will you be alive for until death? The split population likelihood looks like this, and of course, if pi is equal to 1, assuming everybody dies, then it goes right back to the regular survival function. So it's just an addition, it's just really just a mixture model then. So let's look at this data here. I have 402 students from this university, which cover a 12-year period. Here are my means and standard deviations, number of years, 0.7, age, 18.83. Age did not vary much because everybody was either between 17 and 20. And the 20-year-olds, there were only 3 of them. Most persons were male. Only 30% participated in the bridge program. Only 37% were NESRI members. For 1 year was the majority of those NESRI members. And 80% were members within that first semester. And we're going to see why that's important soon. This is just a graph of how we're leaving. And 55% of the students, the 402 students, left the engineering program. 55%, that's a very high percentage. And here are different reasons. Change of major was a big one, but there was also voluntary withdrawal. It's also important to note too that these, though, leaving, I'm looking at first leaving, because there were some students who then came back into the program. So they voluntarily withdrew, and then they came back eventually, whether because now they had the money to deal with it or whatever it was, they came back. So some of these people who dropped, withdrew, or changed major decided to go back at a later date. I'm not looking at that, I'm just looking at when did you first leave. So I have 2 models that I want to present today. In this case, the first risk model is, and I'm using a log logistic function here to estimate this whole split population model. Number of years in NSBE was a significant variable, and the estimated risk for the average group would have been 0.37. Ideally, I want that value when I calculate that average risk to be relatively close to that 55%. So even though this was my best model, I'm a little concerned that this is I'm concerned that that's low. Also, it's important to note too that whether you're in the risk model or the duration model, they're considered two different things. But I cannot put all three NSBE variables into each section. It has to be one or the other because there's high correlation between those two. If you've never been a member of NSBE, then you spent no years in NSBE, then you did not spend your first semester in NSBE, for example. And so we have to choose one of them. So I did quite a number of combinations of those models. Here's what my duration model looks like here. So what we're saying is that if you were in NSBE in your first semester, I have a positive coefficient here, which means then it takes longer for you to quote unquote die or leave the program. So that makes sense, and this log alpha here is the shape variable. The second model I had, which was also which was a pretty good model, was using this NSBE coefficient, NSBE variable here. So were you a member of NSBE? That came out looking good too. And the average group was 0.61, so that's closer to my 55%, but I'm still not too happy with it. I've seen other models where things get closer, but that might be because we need more variables with more information. And again, first semester, again having a positive coefficient, and therefore that looks like it's a very key variable to determining how long you will stay in the program. So I need to include these variables that we have here, because I think we will get a better model at the end of the day. This time varying coefficient variable here seems to be very important. I've seen it used in other retention studies. I would love to look at model fitness, cross-validation techniques, look at departures based on why persons left the program, and of course do internal analysis on just the NSBE students and exclude those that were not NSBE students to just add to it. Of course, there are limitations to the model. I'm missing students' motivation, their attitudes. I don't have anything from family background. Those things are also important. Are diverse first-gen students? What were number of family members, etc. Their financial attributes, whether they're receiving funding, parents' income, etc. And of course, student engagement. Are they engaged in other activities that may also be assisting them with staying in the program? Thank you much.
So next up we have Patrice Anderson.
While it's coming up, I'll introduce myself. So good morning. My name is Patrice Anderson. I am a student of Western Michigan University, past student of the graduate program here at UMona. And I'm presenting a joint work with my co-author, Nicholas Wright, who is from Georgia State University, and is also a past student of the graduate program here. So, the title of my research is, it's an updated title based on what we have here in the schedule. It's Teacher Coaching and High School Performance. And so we're looking at the evidence from a math specialist intervention. Now, when we initially got the data and started looking, the motivation came from a report that was given by the Ministry of Education saying that they would have implemented an intervention program in public high schools, which would have led to an increase in mathematics passes, CSEC math passes. And so they would have devoted about $40 million to implementation of the program. And so we were intrigued to see whether or not the effects that they're claiming were actually true. But as we started the work, more motivation came from the literature. And yes, thank you. Yes, so motivation came from the literature, and what we're seeing is that there was a shift in policy focus from education access to education quality. And this was due to the fact that there was growing access in education. The World Bank, UNICEF were reporting that more countries were providing access in education to their students. And so now the discussion was being focused on quality. And so central to the discussion of education quality is improving performance and participation in STEM subject areas. And so we're talking about the math, the science, and technology. And so to address, another thing that we saw is that to address issues of student performance in the literature is that we're seeing this growing use of what is called in-service teacher training. And so this is a teacher professional development program that focuses on teachers that are already employed within the education system and trying to train and improve teacher quality. And so we're seeing that this type of professional development program is widely used in both developed and developing countries. A research by Strazek et al. In 2014, when they conducted a survey in 2013 of 38 developed and developing countries, showed that 91% of teachers that were employed in lower secondary schools reported that they would have participated in some in-service teacher training in the past 12 months. So what we see is that in-service teacher training is widely used within the education system. However, not much evaluation is being done on the effectiveness of these programs, especially the causal effect of the program, all right? And that's very important for policy, especially because we're seeing a lot of money being implemented in these, in these programs. So the problem being studied here today is that we are going to examine the efficacy of the mathematics intervention program that was implemented in public high schools and to improve the subsequent performance of these students in CSEC mathematics exam. Now, how this fits into the literature is that there's a large body of studies that look at teacher quality, effect of teacher quality on student performance. When we focus on in-service teacher training and specifically teacher coaching, we see a dearth of literature that actually looked at the causal effect of these programs. And so what we're doing, what we also looked at is the effect of these types of professional development programs in technical courses. And when we refer to technical courses in this context, we're talking about like the mathematics and the science areas. So there was very few studies that are looking at that. Now, so we make our contribution primarily by adding to this research body on the causal effect of teacher coaching on technical course areas, the improving performance in those areas, especially at the secondary level. So the preponderance of study that actually looks at the effectiveness of teacher coaching is done at the elementary level. And it's looking at literacy, right? And so we'll see a lot of literacy coaching programs and testing it at the elementary level. So not a lot of evidence is there as to how effective are these programs in technical course areas and at secondary level. So we're contributing to that area. And then secondarily, what we're doing is that we make a simple adjustment to the difference in difference design. And what this does was that we wanted to explain, or the result that we were getting wanted to explain what is the mechanism through which this was happening. And so in doing so, we made a simple adjustment to the difference in difference design that allowed us to really examine the treatment effect when the program would have induced students who are below the average performance of their cohort to sit an exam. So to just give you a preview of what the result is, the results are, so we find evidence that the mathematics intervention program would have induced more students to sit the exam. However, when we look at the effect of this program on the pass rates, the mathematics pass rates, we saw that there was no impact of the program. There was no causal effect of the program on those passes. And this result was consistent across all the different quasi-experimental methods that we used in the study. So a little on the Operation Turnaround program, which is the mathematics teacher coaching program. I'm going to talk about this in the context of Jamaica and using data on Jamaica. So since 2014, given the evidence that the Ministry of Education would have found about this 10-year trend of decline of mathematics passes being less than 45% of the total sitting, they went ahead, implemented a program in public high schools where they basically deployed math specialists to work as coaches for these math teachers. And so some other characteristics of the program was that they targeted poor performing schools, and these are schools that would have recorded a large number of their students getting grades 5 and 6, which we know is the lowest form of failure in C6 scale of grading. And they also treated schools would have remained the same over the 3-year period of the intervention. And the coaches would have served the upper secondary component of school, which would have been the 10th and 11th grade. And then each school was assigned a single coach, and this coach would have gone a full day to each school within a week, in every week. So the data that we're using, we collected data on the universe of high school students between the study period 2009 to 2016. And so this gave us student level data on C6 examination records. On C6 examination records. And the study period that we're looking at here, 2009 to 2016, gives us 5 years of pre-treatment and 3 years of post-treatment. And post-treatment in our context is referring to the years in which the program was actually being done. We also got a secondary data set from the open website of the Ministry of Education, and this was to complement that administrative data that we had, and it provided information on school characteristics. And so we needed information on high school performance, right, the quality of high school performance, wanted information on student characteristics as well as school characteristics. So to jump quickly into the empirical design, so when we have an intervention that is not a randomized control trial, it's really difficult for you to estimate what the causal effect is, right? And so the problems that we're facing with our intervention was that the treatment was not randomly assigned, and the students who are a part of the treatment group are different from those who were not treated. And so to evaluate this, what we do is that we use several quasi-experimental designs. Mainly we use the fixed effect model, which would have given us an understanding of what the exposure effect is to this program within a high school cohort. And then we also use a covariate matching model, which would have balanced out that pre-trend differences that we saw across the two treatment group in the average math performance of students. And to bring some more confidence to the results that we had, we did a few robustness checks where we used the difference in difference design using two separate cohorts. Specifically, we used the untreated public day schools and the private day schools as our cohorts. So just a quick look as to what the models look like. We'll stop for time. But the outcome variable would have been a measure of the quality of the high school performance. And so we have two types of measures here. We have the cumulative measure where the first one option would be that it's the likelihood of getting a grade 1, the likelihood of getting at least a grade 2, the likelihood of passing, the likelihood of getting a severe failing grade, which would have been grade 5 and 6. And then we also look at the probability of getting each of those individual grades that CXC gives, which is from grade 1 through to 6. And of course, the variables of interest are going to be those treatment variables, which are indicator variables, 1 if you are treated or exposed and 0 otherwise. Now, so quick look at what the results look like for the cumulative outcome variable. And what we're seeing here is that we have, for the fixed effect model, if we look here, we're seeing statistically significant negative impact on the likelihood of receiving the different grades, right? If we turn our attention to propensity score matching. We see where for the likelihood of you getting a passing grade and the likelihood of you getting a severe failing grade, we're seeing that there's some negative statistical significance there. And then when we look at multinomial models, similar results, right? So we're seeing negative statistical significance effect of the program, right, on students. So when we jump, what we did next is to do some falsification. Is our model actually telling us the truth, right? And so what we did was that we took a new sample. So the first sample that we took was students who are not taking the mathematics exam, right? And so when we look at these students that are not taking the mathematics exam, we look at if the program had an effect on the performance in low math content courses. So this was a math coaching program. We do not expect that this program will have an effect on a non-math course, right? And especially for students who are not taking mathematics exam. So we used that to see if the program had an effect. Clearly the program had no significant effect, right? So to do a second test, we said, all right, let's keep the same sample, the students who took the math exam. Let's see if the program had any effect on their performance in low math content courses. So we're talking like principles of business and all those courses, sociology and so forth. The program had no effect there. That severe failure, we saw that 10% significance there. We weren't troubled by that, and so we're still remaining confident in the results. So to look at the falsification of our propensity score matching, what we did was that, so for that method we used the course index at matching. And so what that does is that it reduces the imbalances in the pre-trend that exists between the two treatment groups. And so what we're saying is that we're looking, before the intervention, we're trying to find a cohort, a control group that is pretty much similar to the treated group before the intervention. And so if the group that we found from our matching exercise is good, then we expect that there should be no differences in the pre-treatment values for these observables. And so we looked at that, we saw that there was no statistical significance, there was no difference between the treatment group and the control group as it relates to these variables, which is a good sign for the falsification test. So again, to convince readers that our results are strong, what we did was that we did some robustness checks, and this came from the difference in difference. So remember the two control groups that I told you that we chose. What we did is that we just did the basic testing of the parallel pre-trend assumption, right? And so what we're looking at is to look at whether or not before the intervention, the control group and the treatment group would have had a similar trend in the average math passes. And so if we look at this section here, this is before the intervention. We see that the trend is very similar, more similar between the private day school control group. That's not surprising because based on what we're seeing is that the performance in private day schools tend to be closer to poor performing public schools than they are to high performing public schools. And so after treatment, so this we were satisfied with this test of our assumption, parallel trend assumption. And so quickly we look at the difference in difference effect. What we saw was that the program had a negative significant impact. Now the question is, what's happening here, right? And so we look at the mechanism. Now there's a dual effect that is coming out of this program. And the dual effect is that if we think about how we compute math pass rate, right? It's going to be the total number of passes divided by the total number of the persons who sat the exam. The program was affecting both components of the pass rate. So what we did was that we looked at the denominator. How did the program affect the denominator, the cohort size that sit in the exam? It significantly increased the number of persons, so it induced more persons into sitting the exam. When we look at the numerator, the total number of passes, how did the program affect that? It reduced the number of passes. If we look even closely, the amount by which the program reduced the total number of math passes is almost offset by the amount by which it increased the. So once we have adjusted for this change in cohort composition, which is going to be this variable here, we saw that the program had no true effect on average math passes in CSET. And I need to mention that CSET is a standardized exit exam for high school students, right? And so that's as much as I can say. I would have showed you the design that we went through too, but you can talk to me afterwards. All right, so just to conclude, did the program have, did the intervention program work? So what it did was that it induced more students to sit the exam, students who we believe are below the average of those that would have sat the exam in the absence of the program. And what we're saying is that it reduces their total math passes, which has a net effect of no impact on average math passes. All right, and that's it. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm not sure if I should admit that I am also a former student of, master's student of Department of Economics. This work is by Nadine McLeod and myself. We're looking at the issue of do elite schools matter. The literature on the effects of elite schools in improving academic performance is inconclusive. Some studies find positive effects. Example, Pot-Ellichis and Urquella, 2013, Jackson, 2010, and Khadan Giuliano, 2016. Others included Abdulkadir Agnes and Patak, 2014, Agnes, Patak, and Walters, 2013, and Dobby and Fryer Jr., 2010, find no effect. D. and Lang, 2015, and Jeetendra et al., 2012, find negative effects. The majority of the studies are for developed countries. Peer effects are the spillover from peers to a student. One channel is through explicit behavior. Example, high-achieving black students, particularly boys, being stigmatized for academic output. Frey and Torelli, 2010. And this negative effect being reduced by putting high-achieving students in honors classes. Bertstein and Jensen, 2015. Peer effects can also be exerted subliminally through academic performance. A standard assumption is that students are positively influenced by the mean ability of their classmates. Sacerdote, 2011. Peer effects may affect different members of a group in different ways. There might be rank effects. Example, lower rank students might suffer from a negative interpersonal comparison, Huxby and Weingarth, 2006, while students at the top of the class may experience a boost in their self-esteem, Murphy and Weingarth, 2018. Many studies examining the impact of elite schools on academic outcomes employ a regression discontinuity framework coupled with a parametric or non-parametric estimators. Where there are multiple cutoffs, one of two approaches is followed. Either all students face the same set of cutoffs, or each student face one cutoff. An average effect is found by pooling the standardized cutoffs for all schools and then estimating the RD effect. This average effect would be easy to interpret if all the students face the same choices and hence the same cutoffs. With heterogeneous preferences, students face different cutoffs. In such a situation, an average effect would subsume effects at different choice boundaries as well as different cutoff scores for different schools. We are interested in whether attending better, that is more elite schools, as measured by having higher achieving peers, lead to better academic outcomes, and if these outcomes are nonlinear. Using a unique data set from Jamaica, we estimate an average effect using a pooled RD framework. We separately estimate the effects at each of the choice boundaries using parametric and non-parametric methods. Students who are admitted to higher choice schools are excluded when examining lower choices. Students in our multiple cutoff examination may face more than one cutoff. We use 10 short-run academic outcomes. Probability of taking a CSEC, that is the high school exit exam, receiving a certificate, that is 5 or more CSEC passes, including English and math, number of CSEC exams taken, number of CSEC exams passed, the probability of taking math, math grade, probability of taking English, the English grade, and the number of grades 1 and 2, which are the 2 highest grades. When using the conventional approach of pooling, the cutoffs, we find no significant effect on any of our 10 outcomes. Using subsampled of stacked data to examine the effects at different boundaries, we find no significant effect on any of our outcomes for choice 1, 2, and 4 at conventional levels. For choice 3, we find a negative effect for taking CSEC at the 10% level, and for choice 5, 6 variables are positively impacted by getting into choice 5 versus not getting in. These are obtaining a certificate, number of exams passed, taking math, math grade, and the number of highest grades, and the number of the 2 highest grades. Parametric estimations at the boundary of choice 1 show a negative and highly significant effect on all outcomes except taking CSEC. At the boundary of choice 2, there's a negative effect on the number of exams taken. At boundary of choice 3, there are positive effects on the probability of taking math, math grade, the number of grade 1s. There is a positive effect at boundary 4 for the number of grade 1s. At choice 5, there are positive and significant effects on all outcomes except the probability of taking English. In essence, the average treatment effect on getting into a more elite school appears highly nonlinear across choice boundaries. Our data covers a period in which there is a common high school entrance exam known as GSAT, Grade 6 Achievement Test, and a common high-stake high school exit exam, CSEC, that is the Caribbean Schools Examination Council exams. Both exams are set and graded by persons external to the school which the children attend. The high school curriculum is standard across all schools. Our data allow us to use a RD design to compare the academic outcome of otherwise identical students who end up on different sides of the cutoff boundary and therefore attend different quality schools. Students at the time of registration for GSAT exam indicate their ranked preferences for 5 high schools. They are assigned to schools based on their preferences and their performance on the GSAT exam. Each school has a cutoff which is exogenous to each student and each school, determined after GSAT has been taken and based on declared spaces by gender. It is therefore impossible to game the system. The GSAT exam has 5 sections: math, science, social studies, language arts, and communication tasks. Our data include the grades on each section. In addition to preferences, we have demographic data and whether the student is on PATH. That is a poverty alleviation program which includes a lunch subsidy. The data also includes information on the school which each child attended at the primary level. The Caribbean Secondary Examination Certificate, CSEC, database contained demographic data on each student, candidate number, examination center, school name, proficiency level of the subject, profiles 1 through 4, and the overall grade awarded for each subject, 1 through 6. Grades 1, 2, and 3 are passing grades. The others are not. And there are 35 subjects from which students may choose. We also have data on teachers and the results of school inspectorate by the National Education Inspectorate. We also have data on each high school from the annual high school census. We will not describe these data here, as we're not using them for this study at this moment. Merging GSAT and CSEC data for various years gives the following observations. This presentation is based on students who took GSAT in 2011 and CSEC 5 years later in 2016, and we take account of early takers. 43,480 children sat GSAT in 2011 from 1,021 primary prep schools, with 38,447 being placed in 164 CSEC taking high schools. This table summarizes our data. We can see from the top panel, that's the top 3 rows, that the average score decreases monotonically with placement choice. The middle panel of the table show average CSEC results 5 years later, and we see that the results decrease on average for lower placements. And the bottom panel gives average characteristics of the high schools in various choice groups. This graph shows the kernel density estimate. We see the probability distribution of the standardized GSAT score, with the preferred schools having higher means and less variance. This graph shows the cumulative distribution of GSAT scores by choice, with higher choices being to the right of lower choices. And this graph is a histogram of the standardized GSAT scores. Here we have our model specification. GSAT I is the centered GSAT score of student I who is admitted to school S. If his score is above CS, the cutoff score for school S. YIS is the outcome of student I at school S. The function f is a smooth polynomial function. TKIS is a dummy variable equal to 1 if GSAT I was greater than CS for student I's kth choice. Beta is the parameter of interest to us, and XIS is a vector of predetermined covariates. Equation 1 is a pooling model, and equation 2 estimates multiple cutoffs. Now, there are 3 methods used in placing students to schools. The Ministry of Education places students in descending order of GSAT performance. Preference method allocates a student to her highest preferred school, which has space when it is her turn to be placed. If the student cannot be placed by preference method, she is placed by proximity if space is available. This is the secondary method. If the first 2 methods fail to place a student, she's manually placed by the ministry. Total GSAT scores are continuous on the interval 0 to 500. Cutoff scores and placement are determined after the GSAT is taken, and neither school nor student can manipulate scores to guarantee a match. We test to ensure that there is no manipulation. We use histograms and kernel density plots of center GSAT scores relative to cutoffs. In order to identify causal effects, students must be similar just above and just below the thresholds. We will also do a covariance balance test. Here we have the histogram of the standardized GSAT scores centered around the simulated cutoffs. The red line at 0 crosses the histogram along a horizontal path, so we're good. The kernel density plot of centered GSAT scores relative to cutoff shows no discontinuity at 0. The regression discontinuity plot of centralized standardized GSAT scores relative to cutoff shown here shows no break outside of the confidence interval. Covariance balance tests shown here all have p-values exceeding 5%, with the exception of region 5, which leads us to believe that a regression discontinuity effect is not generated by any of the variables listed. This diagram shows that there's a jump in the mean pair GSAT score once the threshold is crossed. This line is a fitted, the line is a fitted 4th order polynomial. And here we're following Kaloniko et al. 2017 robust estimator. Here we have the linear fit
to the data again, we see the jump in the mean GSAT score once the threshold is crossed. This plot is generated under the default assumption of Kollenko. Examining the discontinuity at each choice level using a fourth order polynomial fit. This is for choice 1. Here we have choice 2. Here we have choice 3. Choice 4. And choice 5. Now these are the results from the pooled approach. We find no significant effect on any of our 10 variables. Turning now to the multiple treatment across choice subsamples, we see no significant effect at choice 1. Choice 2 also shows no significant effect. Choice 3 shows a negative effect for taking CSEC at the 10% level, and there is no significant effect at choice 4. Choice 5 has significant positive effects on 6 of the 10 variables. Obtaining a certificate, taking math grades, grade 1 and 2, grade 1 and grades 1 and 2. These non-parametric results might be cause for concern, as it is possible that there is not enough data to get close to an asymptotic distribution. We will have a little bit more confidence in these results when we include data from other cohorts. Now, this table reports the parametric results for the first 4 variables of interest to us. Only at threshold 5 is taking CSEC positive and significant. At all other thresholds, it is insignificant. Obtaining a certificate is negative at choice 1 and positive at choice 5. Taking CSEC is negative at the first 2 choices and positive at 5. Exam passed is negative at choice 1 and positive at choice 5. The other 6 variables are all negative at choice 1 and positive at choice 5, with the exception of taking English. Choice 3 has a positive effect for taking math grade, and obtaining the highest grade. Choice 4 shows a positive effect of obtaining the highest grade. Now, the average treatment effect on getting into a more elite school appears highly nonlinear across choice boundaries. Our finding would not be inconsistent with a ranked effect. The negative effect of choice 1 indicates that students who just get into their first choice schools do worse than children who just missed out. Students who just got in would be at the bottom of the quality distribution and subject to negative interpersonal comparisons, while those who just missed out would be towards the top of the quality distribution in the schools they attend and may experience a top of the class effect. Also, it is possible that teachers at the top schools are teaching to the average, which is above where the people who just got in are, and when you get into the second choice, they're teaching to the average and you're above the average. Choice 2 only matters for taking exams, which has a negative effect. Highly qualified peers have a positive effect at choice 3 for some variables, taking math grade and the number of grade 1s. For choice 4, higher quality peers matter only for obtaining grade 1s, while for choice 5, there is a positive effect from having higher quality peers on all variables, except taking English. Where do we go from here? We will utilize data from the other 7 cohorts which we have. We will incorporate data from other sources. Example, the National Educational Inspectorate, the school census, data on teachers, administrators, etc., to delve deeper into our explanation. We will examine responses by gender. And we will also explore alternative model specification, estimation methods, and other sensitivity checks. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. So my topic today will be about the attitudes towards scholarship bonding. And of course, this is actually preliminary work, so we're open to any feedback or suggestions that you may give. In the United States, US 100 million in funds goes unclaimed each year because persons are unaware that these funds exist. Now, when you break that down, and you, in the Jamaican context, that could send 24,000 students to school, which is more, for 1 year, which is more than the entire student population at the UWI. Now, this unclaimed fund also occurs in the EU at 620 million, and bringing it home now in terms of, for Jamaica, Jamaicans have access to 4.25 billion in scholarships. So this led me to ask the question, who are offering these scholarships? Which organizations are offering these scholarships? What are the subject area for these scholarships? Natural sciences, social sciences, and how do you access or apply for these scholarships? And so that led to the formation of our company, Scholastic Oasis Caribbean, to answer some of those questions that I mentioned before, and to also provide scholarship matching and application support for global tertiary education. Now, our company provides the following services: scholarship search, scholarship matching, and application support. And we deliver this through the mediums of seminars, one-on-one consultation, and attending career fairs. But we have recognized the importance of research in the company in terms of driving the company's operations and in terms of the decisions that we make and the target groups. Because we really wanted to find out why was there so much unclaimed funds? Were Jamaicans aware that these funds existed? Did they qualify for these funds? And was it that the application process maybe have been an issue? So we started off with a first survey to test awareness. We're uncertain as to why. And we spoke to 182 persons between that period of time, wanted to test the hypothesis that Jamaicans were not aware of these global scholarship opportunities. But we found out that 60% of those surveyed actually believed that opportunities existed. The issues that they had was that information on the scholarships was hard to find, and we also got results of difficulties in terms of how exactly to apply. So all of these questions were coming up. I mentioned before the why, the unclaimed funds, the Jamaicans in terms of their unawareness or awareness for these funds. Did they qualify for these funds? Was the application process an issue? And so also during our seminars, other questions came up. Was it an issue of bonding, scholarship bonding? Was there some connection to unclaimed funds as well? And so this led to this particular research. And so I've given you some background, and I've spoken about the research problem in terms of the unclaimed funds being unused. So we want to look on the research objectives, the methodology, and preliminary results, and some next steps. Let's start with the research objectives. So really, it was basically to ascertain the perceptions, the views, the attitudes towards tertiary scholarship bonding by Jamaicans, and hopefully gain some implications for whether persons chose scholarships or not. And just to be on the same page, quickly to let you know that the scholarship bond involves scholarship recipients either serving their country or an organization for a period of time, whether in return for the payment of tuition and school-related expenses, and can range anywhere from 2 to 5 years. So what was the methodology? We basically administered a survey face-to-face, or it was sent via email. It's an electronic form, which had 26 questions, for the most part multiple choice and some open-ended questions. And we targeted males and females between the ages of 15 to 39 years who either attended or were attending secondary school to get their perspective, a tertiary perspective. This was really a convenient sample because it was done during some of our seminars as well as our attendance at career fairs and public events. And so we targeted persons who attended the event and interacted with us at our booth. So the survey is new. It started December 2018, and we want to carry it to November 2019. So far, we've only collected 49 responses. some preliminary results. In terms of gender, most of the persons were female, 57%. In terms of the age groups, we're talking most of the persons surveyed were between the ages of 20 to 24. That's almost 45%. And we asked them simply to say, what is a scholarship bond? Because we wanted to kind of find out if they knew what that was. And about roughly 70% of them knew what the scholarship bond was, serving a country in exchange. But some people actually put in that it was an interest-bearing security. I think that's about 14.3%. And another said they're not sure, they don't know. And there was actually somebody who selected a debt owed to a financial institution. So that question was really to really find out if they really knew what that was. And that's the first question. The other question was, is it fair? Is bonding fair? Is it reasonable? And almost 78% said yes, right? How long should persons be bonded for? Most of the responses range from 1 to 5 years, but the one that occurred the most was for 2 years. Person said mostly 2 years. But we also asked them, so that was the open-ended one, and then we asked them specific ones now. How do you feel about 1 year, being bonded for 1 year? And of course, 98% said yes. We said, okay, what about 7 years? And of course, 51% said no, right? So the longer the period. So we decided now to kind of vary it. Should bonding be based on your specific subject or your course area? And 44.9% said no. You know, a good portion was not sure. 20.4% were not sure, and 34.7% said yes, it should be based on that. For those who did say yes, which subjects? And STEM ranked first, right? Followed by social sciences second. Should bonding be based on the desired country to study in? And almost 50% said yes. Which countries? You can see that the USA, UK, and Canada have the most responses, right? Because that's where most of the students actually go to or desire to go to based on our prior research that we conducted as well. Followed by Europe, almost 35%. So we asked them, aside from bonding, if you don't like the whole idea of bonding, what else? What else can you recommend for the scholarship funder to gain back their return on their investment? So they mentioned things like volunteerism, partnerships, community service, mentorship, being a part of mentorship program, actually endorsing the country or the government. The funder asking them for donations. Payments from their earnings. Some of them will be willing to pay from their earnings for receiving the scholarship or being an ambassador for the company or the government, or also being, you're laughing, internships, or also working with the government or with the company in terms of on-the-job training. So some quick conclusions are basically that most respondents to date understand what the bonding is. But a quick thing to add to that, we want to kind of look further into the 30% who didn't understand to find out what their response were really like. If throughout the survey at the end they came to recognize what it was or they still didn't know, we need to do further analysis there. Generally speaking, bonding is considered reasonable, but reasonable between 1 to 2 years. If it should be done by subject areas, they're thinking that it's STEM, and if it should be done by country, it would be USA, UK, and Canada. And some other ways to recover that investment would be volunteerism. So some next steps to administer more surveys to get that margin of error down, to sort the responses by gender, because we didn't sort it by gender to get if there was any differences there. Analyze the response of persons who did not understand what bonding was. And further analysis. There's a mistake right there. Thank you.
So I'd like to restrict it to 1 question per questioner, and if you can, try to spread the questions across the presenters. So, okay, it doesn't matter. Yeah.
All right. I just have one question for Patrice. Yes, so Patrice, I know you spent a lot of time trying to convince us that those results are robust, but I have one concern really, which you made reference to it, in the sense that most of the schools that would have been targeted for this program, the program would have specifically targeted schools with weaker performing students, which implies that there's some reverse causality issues going on there. The next aspect of this is that your basic conclusion is that there are no effects coming out of the model. Now, it's kind of hard to sell this kind of findings or this kind of evidence to, say, for the Ministry of Education. What exactly would you tell them? That they should just scrap the program, or should they basically stop targeting schools with weak students?
So, so that's basically the question where I'm at in the research as to how am I going to package this to so that policymakers can really receive it. So, as it relates to the issue of reverse causality, so here's one of the things that I didn't mention in my talk, and is that not all schools that were identified as needing treatment were actually treated. And that was good for us because that gave us a good control group, right? And so in the matching, we really were matching on trying to get as much of those schools that were not treated, but we know that they are OTA, right? They're getting, have a large number of students that is receiving grade 5 and 6 passes. And so, that really helped us in matching, in the matching issue. I'm not quite agreeing with you with the reverse causality, but I guess we can discuss that outside of the panel here. As it relates to how I would tell the the government, the ministry. So this is what I'm saying. So I think there's more to be done. So the program would have targeted the teachers, and what they're expecting is that they would have improved teacher quality, and then because of this, teacher would have gotten better at teaching the course, they've learned some, benefited from the program, and then this would have translated into student performance. So we don't have information on teachers. So I think the first thing that I would have to do, what I want to do next, is to try and get from the ministry any information that we can get on the teachers to actually see, did the program actually have an effect on teachers? Because if the program had no effect on teachers, then that's the channel through which they were expecting the improvement in students to happen. So we first need to know, was the program successful in improving teacher instructions and quality? And then from there. So I wouldn't tell them to scrap the program, because I think we need to go back to the drawing board as to how to properly test the effect of these programs. And so we need data on the teachers to see what's happening there. And definitely not stop sending coaches into underperforming schools. And one of the issues that the government would have relayed as the cause for this 10-year trend in math passes being less than 45% was that they did not have enough trained and qualified teachers within secondary education. And so, so definitely there's work to be done there. So I definitely wouldn't tell them to scrap a program. We need more testing.
Okay, next.
Yes, so my question is for Kellyanne. I really loved your presentation because I actually have a good friend of mine back in the US who's part of NSBE. So I'm very jealous of her when she goes to the conferences and she talks about how all the stuff that they do. And I wish like Econ had a very similar thing for young black economists. My only question is, I've done in my PhD program a lot of work on duration models and those hazard functions and survival functions, and so I've always found them to be very, very unwieldy, and they take forever to like work through. would a simple linear probability model also have achieved some of the results that you're looking at? Because your outcome is whether or not they exited the program. So I'm wondering if maybe like a logit or probit could work, or is there like some significant econometric or statistical reason why you have to use a survival model?
So why we chose a survival model was, yes, so a logit could work because then did you leave, did you not leave? But what it's not able to incorporate at the same time is how long did it take before you left? And that's what we're also trying to get at. So yes, there's some at risk, and we want to identify what causes that risk and what will reduce it, what will increase it. But we also want to be able to identify how long will it take before you leave the program. And so that's why we chose the survival. We originally started with just basic survival, but then realizing that we're violating that assumption of death, then that's when we stepped up to the split population model, and it looks at, but it simultaneously gives us both risk and duration. And duration is extremely important because then you know at the end of the day, we're supposed to be able to predict based on whatever covariates we're using, how long it will take, given that you're at risk, for you to leave the program. So if we know, for example, with a certain set of covariates X, that you are going to be likely to leave the program in your third semester, then we can start especially ramping up whatever mechanisms in your first and second semester to hold you further in the third semester.
And then a quick follow-up. How do you measure like active participation in NSBE? So for example, okay, go ahead.
Right, so it's not exactly active participation.
You just need to be a
We're
member.
using a participation based on registration as a NSBE member.
So if I just sign, I'm a NSBE member, but doesn't go to any conferences, don't do anything, it's considered that I'm in.
Right, as long as you paid your membership fee.
I see.
Yeah, so you had to pay a fee.
So
we're assuming that given that you paid the fee, that you are going to participate. You're right.
Okay.
But you know, there will be some who will pay the fee and just keep it moving.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Somebody's hand was probably up before mine.
Okay, hold on.
Hi, Patrice, and me, we have to talk, because, so for people who don't know, I'm Linda Bailey, also a past MSc Econ student. What I'm doing now is actually something called Reggae Math Foundation. We're doing teacher training in the schools. So one of the explanations, so one of the things that you have is the teachers move, right? So Immaculate loses teachers, Campion loses teachers. As we know, all of these schools are losing teachers everywhere to the US, UK, Canada, Middle East, right? So what's happening then is that you have a school like Cumberland. We met an amazing teacher from Cumberland. She was in Cumberland. Cumberland gets the bottom student, gets what they call the what left students, right? That's students at the bottom of the GSAT. They're illiterate, right? They're at the K level going into Cumberland High, right? So speaking to the people there, I mean, teachers who come in, who know the maths, who want to try and help us, they're not trained to deal with the K level student. They're going in to teach high school. So that teacher that we met left and went to a better school. So what you're seeing, a teacher going there, they might have a great teacher quality, but they're not trained. They might know the maths, but they're not trained to teach remediation to a 14-year-old illiterate person. And we can actually do that, but these teachers are not trained and they're leaving to go where they can make a difference. So you need to follow the teachers. That's what you need to get to see if the teachers, in terms of the coaching, some of the teachers. So there's a problem when you have a coach who is actually effective. So first of all, the schools love the coaching. They want more of it. They think it's insufficient. Right? And that's qualitative data. When you just go in there and talk to the people what they think of this program. The schools love that program, right? So there's no way that should be removed. That's one of the things that we can say is positive over there. But some of the teachers may not be receptive to the coaching. So you as a coach can tell the teacher, and I'm going to tell you this is an actual thing that happened. Had a teacher and the coach, like 4 of us were telling you have to teach long division, the concept of what this kid is doing. And the teacher said to us, and this is the problem, the teacher said to us, teaching the concept takes too long. I want to help that kid pass the exam. I have to teach them the algorithm to get them to pass that exam. I cannot teach the concept. The teacher, that we are coaches, so they have the grade, the coach, no problem with the coaches. The mentality of some of the teachers, they're trying to help these kids, and they're teaching them a pattern just to get through this exam. Anyway, let me stop. We'll talk after. We'll talk. Yes.
Sorry to the other panel, but this question is also for Patrice. So you are seeing a negative statistically insignificant effect, and you're interpreting
significant.
Why do you interpret it as a null effect?
So what happened was that the variable I was looking at is pass rate, right, which comprises of the total number of passes over the total cohort that sat the exam, the number of persons who sat the exam. So the program has an effect on both components of that variable, right? And so what happened is that initially we did not control for the change that is the compositional change that's happening in cohort size. And so what we're picking up is that we're saying that, okay, if for example, the program would have induced 10 persons to sit the exam, and we have a case where only 2 of these persons actually pass, these new persons that come in that actually pass, we know that this brings down the actual pass, the pass rate, right? And so what the program was picking up is that we didn't control for the fact that the cohort is changing, and so for you to actually know the true effect of the program, you need to say, okay, let's see if let's assume that the cohort size remain the same. What happens to the total? What happens to the total pass rate, given that took place?
So the final coefficient after adjusting for all of those concerns, was that statistically significant?
No.
No, it wasn't. My question is, the variation you're exploiting is at the school level. Do you have sufficient variation to precisely identify a reasonably but small effect size?
So we don't have a lot of observation at the school level, and that's just because of the fact that the amount of schools that got actually treated. So there's definitely merit to what you're saying, and I'm aware of the fact that we don't have enough observation, but as it is right now, that's the best that we really could do with what's happening. And when we analyze the data, and if you remember, we look at the trend, when we look at the pre-trend analysis and look at what happened in the post, what we see a similar trend, just the same between among the different groups. So we're seeing for real that there's not much change in that average pass rate that's happening for both the treated group and the control group. So there's definitely a lot more work to be done. This is just the preliminary results that we have by first running the regressions. But yeah, we do not have enough, we don't have a large sample at the school level, which is why we went down to the student level to do much of our analysis. But once you got that negative effect, we had to look into what was driving this, right? Because that would have meant that the program is just reducing the number of passes that's happening. And so you had to go further. That's when we went further. It's possible, yes. But for this, you definitely have to investigate more what's happening. Yeah. So that's not something that you can just take that result and say, okay, this is what is happening. So you had to investigate more what is happening. Let's look at the cohort size. Does the program have an effect on cohort size? And if it does, by right, we have to adjust for that compositional change and to look what happens to pass rate when we adjust for that. And what we saw was that, hey, the pass rate, the program really had no effect.
Okay, and just one final comment. I'm actually not trying to contradict you, but what you observed as being negative, it could be truly negative and you just don't have the power to detect it.
To detect that it's truly
because you have
negative.
all kinds of quality concerns that is embedded in this process. So I would be cautious in interpreting it as a null effect. That's all.
If to be honest, that's definitely where we were. On the fact that, listen, the program does have some, it has some negative effect. We know for sure it has. But what we're saying is that, so it has a negative effect in reducing the number of total passes, yes. As it relates to the pass rate, I wasn't convinced that it was negative for the pass rate. It was reducing the total number of passes, negative effect on the total number of passes. But as it relates to the pass rate and how we actually computed that variable, we weren't convinced that it is. But yeah, definitely.
Okay, so are there any other questions, particularly for the speakers that haven't gotten any yet? Does anybody have one? You have one? Yeah.
I'll shoot out two questions to Dr. Gordon and Ms. Hyman. For Dr. Gordon, the title of the presentation was Do Elite Schools Matter? And I'm wondering if the categorization of elite schools and the school ranking is endogenous or exogenous. By that I mean, if I'm a low ability student, then my ranking list may be to put a low ranking school. That's not an elite school. So I'm curious to see how you account for that. And for Ms. Hyman, I'm very interested in the topic. I wondered if I may have missed it, but to me, I think there was an important question that wasn't asked, which was, many people view bonding as reasonable, and I do too. And I thought an important question would be, would you take a scholarship if you were bonded? And for me, I think you may get interesting results. So although people may find it reasonable, they still wouldn't take it. Why is that? And I think that's an important question to ask.
In looking at our thing, it's not that we start with that there is a set of schools that are elite, right? Elite will be defined simply as I'm trying to get into a school with a higher score. So if I'm a low ability student and I pick 5 relatively low schools, the best of that is elite for me.
I could put my lower rank school first and then my higher rank.
What we also see is that there's a high correlation between the average incoming grade and the ranks. Sorry.
I think that question was asked. I need to go back and look on the survey. But I think that you can, there are certain, because there are more questions, it's 20 odd questions, that you can pick up that answer from it. I just need to review and see if it comes out. But yes, maybe it could be adjusted to say directly, because maybe they could be giving their opinions on the whole bonding, but not necessarily willing to take the bond. So that's a good observation. Thank you.
Reasonable. I'm not sure if I'll take that chance.
Reasonable until you have to do it.
Remember that you did see though that if it was for a year, you did see that if it was a year or two, then yeah, I will bounce it, but not beyond that. So that also is a contributing factor.
Just also another question, because I found this interesting. So for example, the Commonwealth Scholarship gives you, if you're doing a master's degree, it's a 1-year program, but you're bonded for 5 years. While, yes. But if it's, well, yes, but most programs do Commonwealth. But for example, Fulbright, if you're going to do a PhD, you're bonded for 2 years. Yes. So that would be also one of the questions I would look at, because to me it seems disproportionate. I've only gone for 1 year, you paid for 1 year. Yes, it was wonderful, but you're bonding me for 5 years.
Good observation, because one comment when we were going through, because there are some open-ended questions that one person mentioned that they feel that they should be bonded for the same period of the course. Right. So that was a suggestion. So I just need to find out how many and probably tabulate it. Yeah. Believe that.
Exactly. Yeah, so that was my question. So, I mean, I think there is a demand side for sure, even filter demand, and then there is a supply side. Because I believe if you were to interview those providing those scholarships, certainly the cost dimension would enter the picture. I mean, I think that the time for which the commit you will not be independent on the cost. And I guess some of the results that you found in terms of US, Canada, those are probably the most expensive destination and also will drive what people's perception about those programs. So I was wondering about the supply side. And although the moderator sent a question to Patrice, I'm still trying to figure out if, I mean, have you presented this to the Ministry of Education? But I think it's a good place to start, although we all want to have you here. But I think it would be a good idea to actually go talk to them. We already had a lot of insight from our colleague here as to why the result that you're finding. I was wondering to which extent is because of the way the variable is measured, and you spoke to that in terms of, and she spoke to that in terms of, you know, what is the ultimate objective of the teacher is to get student through the exam, passing the exam. So I was wondering if that, you know, you have continuous result. So scoring of the, you know, rather than using passed or fail, do you have kind of a continuum scoring where you can just look at the actual score, you know, beyond just passing? That could maybe give you more variability and mitigate some of the result that you're having. And also maybe, is there a timing, when is the training, when does the training occur, and when does the exam occur? How far apart, how long does that, you know, program takes before the exam?
Okay, so good comment about having a continuum for the grade. The issue with that is most of those tests that provides those grades are not standardized. And so it differs by class, by the teacher, how they set the exam, the difficulty of the exam and stuff like that would not be a good, it wouldn't be a good variable to use. So first, and then the other thing is that the program, the coaching is designed based on feedback that CSEC provides, based on how poor, what areas were the schools performing poorly in, what areas were the students performing poorly. And so they designed the coaching experience based on, to address those issues that are coming from CSEC. So using the performance on CSEC would have been the best option in that situation. Your second, the timing. Okay, good. Yes. So the good thing is that this program is a intense program and has a long duration. So it's at the beginning of the school year, and a coach visits the school every week. A full day every week, work with the teachers. And so there's a lot of time. There's a lot of situations are provided where they can get feedback. So it's not like a one-off workshop that happens at one time and you send the teacher out there and never check up to see what's happening. So yeah, it really provides that opportunity to get feedback and to adjust.
Okay, so I'd like to close the session now. So thanks to all the speakers, and I'm sure they'll answer questions if you have any more.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Before everybody rushes off, I'd just like to, first of all, thank everyone for coming and to say that we hope we see everybody here again next year for WECON 2020. And before you leave, we actually want to take a group photo. So if everybody could just come to the front, Sam here is going to direct the photograph.